Hey guys, this is Star What If. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see second part what if Harry Potter returned to Hogwarts as a new legend. Here is short summary. After surviving 2 years of intense trials, Harry Potter returns to Hogwarts for his third year, transformed by his near-death experiences. With new skills, allies, and a bold outlook, the boy who lived is ready to redefine his destiny and claim his greatness. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. On Christmas morning, Harry woke to snowfall outside his window, and a pile of presents at the foot of his bed. It was no longer a surprise to actually receive presents, but Harry took a moment to marvel over the reality that he was loved, that he mattered, before he actually opened them. As he did, Athena burrowed further beneath his covers, and he supposed the cold wasn't kind to her old bones. Among his gifts, he received a knitted jumper and a tin of fudge from Mrs. Weasley, a magical Walkman and the first Nirvana EP from Justin, and a set of eagle feather quills from Susan. Theo, coincidentally, gifted him with a set of twin daggers, Fred and George with a box of Zonko's products, and a set of Seeker's gloves from Angelina, Alicia, Katie, and Oliver. Ron gave him the customary box of sweets. Professors Flitwick, Lupin, and Hermione, too, each gifted him with a book, and finally, Sirius had bought him a new broom. A firebolt, specifically. He'd admired it over the summer, and knew, all too well, how valuable it was. Harry held it in reverent hands, uncertain if he should be grateful or not. It was a work of art, most definitely, but at the same time, Harry felt as though it came with a price tag, the broom, for his affection. Perhaps he was just bitter, but before Harry could dwell on it, Neville knocked on his door with word that brunch would be ready soon. Harry washed his face and dressed for the day, casual in a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, and a dark blue pullover. He tugged on his sneakers, carded a hand through his flyaway hair, and descended the staircase to find the den crowded with Neville's family. He suddenly felt remarkably underdressed. Neville approached him with a grin, and proceeded to introduce Harry to a bunch of people whose names Harry forgot shortly thereafter. There was his great-uncle Algy, who'd dropped Neville out of a window when he was 8, his great-aunt Nolene, a variety of aunts, uncles, and cousins, and by the time brunch was served, Harry was mildly overwhelmed. Excepting great-uncle Algy, they're all maternal relatives, Neville said quietly. Strictly speaking, I'm the last of the Longbottom line. It's why they were so concerned that I didn't have magic. That doesn't justify their treatment, Harry answered bitterly, and Neville could only shrug. He had no argument, and in his mind, it could have been much worse. Harry himself didn't even want to think about it. Otherwise, he'd have to label his own treatment at the hands of his own relatives, and he really didn't want that label over his head. He was not a victim. Shortly after midday, the guests began to trickle out, and by 1 o'clock, Harry, Neville, and Lady Longbottom were on their way to St. Mungo's. Despite himself, Harry was nervous, and he wondered how his upcoming meeting with Sirius would go. Correspondence between them had been tentative at best, and undeniably awkward to boot, and his trust was a hard thing to come by. Then again, Black did try to protect him, for the most part. A part of Harry was certain that Sirius had acted mostly out of revenge, but he had sought Harry out on Privet Drive. Harry couldn't forget that. You look terrified, Neville commented. I am, Harry admitted. They slowed to a stop by the receptionist's desk, where Harry was informed that Sirius Black was a patient in the hospital's long-term wing. Neville quietly explained that his parents were too, and they led him to the elevators in solemn silence. It seemed, though, that Sirius had a private room, because the Longbottoms stopped him in front of a room with a closed door and curtained windows. Would you like us to stay, Harry? Neville queried. Harry shook his head. No. Thanks for the offer, Nev. I think I'd like to do this alone, though. Sure, mate, Neville acquiesced genially. We'll be in the room at the end of the wing. The Longbottoms left, and Harry was alone. He shook himself, took a bracing breath, and knocked on the door. He was surprised, then, to see a pinch-faced woman with stern gray eyes answer. He wondered, briefly, if he'd arrived at the wrong room. "Harry Potter," she greeted mildly, "we've been expecting you." Mildly perturbed, Harry followed her into the room, and looked around curiously. On the bed, Sirius Black watched him through weary gray eyes, thin, and mildly jaundiced, but healthier than he'd appeared in the Daily Prophet, or even at his trial. He'd put on some weight, he'd lost the beard and the matted hair, and he wore a small, tired smile. "Hello, Harry," Sirius greeted him. He took in Harry's features, and smiled wistfully. "If Remus hadn't forewarned me, I'd have thought you James come back to life." "Godric, the resemblance is uncanny." "I've been told that," Harry acknowledged, approaching the bed. "Hello, Sirius, how are you?" "I've been worse," Sirius answered flippantly, and his gaze flickered to the woman behind Harry. "But never mind that, I want you to meet Cassiopeia. She's my great-aunt, and she's yours, too." Harry turned, and the woman scrutinized him with a gimlet eye. She didn't appear malicious, but neither did she appear kind, and Harry was wary. He'd had bad experiences with aunts. One was a harpy, 2 were dead, and the last, Marge, wasn't even blood. "You'll do well, I think." "Pardon." A corner of her lips pulled up in the slightest of smiles. "Why, as Lord Black, of course. Better than Narcissus' spawn, in any case. Your wardrobe needs work, however, no scion of the House of Black will be caught dead in those muggle rags." "If I recall correctly, I wore those so-called rags regularly," Sirius interjected glibly. "They're quite comfortable, Cass. You should try it sometime." To Harry, he added, "Wear whatever you like, Harry. The only time it will ever matter is in the Wizengamot." Cassiopeia glared, outraged, but said nothing. Instead, she settled in the seat located in the corner of the room, withdrew a small black journal from her bag, and apparently tuned out the 2 remaining occupants. Sirius himself caught Harry's gaze, raised his hand to his ear, and twirled his index finger in a circle. Harry, in turn, laughed. Sirius, he thought, was an all-right bloke. It would be cool to get to know him better. At the very least, Harry hoped so. Sirius grinned, pleased. He gestured for the teen to take a seat on the edge of his bed, and as Harry did so, Sirius requested, "Will you tell us about yourself?" Harry fidgeted, uncomfortable under their undivided attention. "What would you like to know?" "Anything," Sirius replied, "everything. Whatever you're happy to share. I've got a lifetime's worth of things to learn about you." Despite himself, Harry smiled. There had been very few people interested in Harry, just Harry, and as he began to answer their questions, he sort of liked it. He wasn't sure if it was something he could get used to, of course, though he was certainly willing to try. Even better, Cassiopeia and Sirius were willing to let him. January 4th. Harry's time with Sirius and Cassiopeia ended on a positive note. They'd discussed his classes, and when they'd learned of his hectic schedule, both Cassiopeia and Sirius had insisted that he drop legal studies, estate management, and economics, with the explanation that it would be Sirius' responsibility to tutor Harry in those subjects, and then some, during the summer holidays. Harry had acquiesced without complaint, and afterwards, the 2 blacks occupied Harry's time with verbal spars regarding politics and politicians, bickering about relatives Harry didn't know, and questioning Harry himself about his life, his interests, and his friends. In turn, they'd shared aspects of their own lives, and before he'd known it, Lady Longbottom and Neville were at the door, and it was time for Harry to leave. He'd done so with only faint reluctance. These people were his family, yes, but he'd known them only a day. He was currently more fond of what they represented, as opposed to the individuals themselves. It would change in time, but for the moment, Harry was honest, brutally so, when he admitted, if only to himself, that he wouldn't miss them. Afterwards, the holidays zipped by in a blur of letters, holiday homework, conversations with Neville, and idle musings over what the next term would bring. On occasion, they would play outside, but snowball fights weren't nearly so exciting with only 2 players, and thus, most of their time was spent indoors, keeping themselves entertained with chess, gobstones, snap, or books. To Harry, however, it was the companionship that really mattered, and by the time they were headed back to London, he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so content. Another 5 months with Professor Snape, Neville said, weary. It could be Lockhart, Harry opined, and his fellow Gryffindor grimaced. Merlin, a year with both of them was the worst, Neville said, emphatic. Preaching to the choir, mate. What? Harry shook his head, muggle expression. Never mind. They each bade farewell to Lady Longbottom, boarded the Hogwarts Express, and settled themselves in a compartment near the end of the train. The platform was bustling, the corridors were too, but as Harry withdrew a deck of standard playing cards, neither Gryffindor was ruffled. Can I ask you something, Harry? Upon Harry's nod, Neville inquired, what are you going to do about Greyback? Discreetly, Harry lifted one of his trouser legs to reveal the dagger holstered to his calf. He'd carried it with him since Christmas Day, its partner in an invisible holster at his belt. Both blades were molded from silver, their handles finely carved ivory. They were from Theo, and they were a wonder. Not for the first time, he marveled over the value of gifts given by wealthy friends. Theo's gift would have cost an arm and a leg, and Neville, along with his grandmother, had gifted him a delicate, solid gold display snitch. Harry hadn't even tried to guess at the price of it. Are you worried? Neville queried. Harry lifted his hand lazily, palm to the floor, and tilted it side to side. More or less. I'm used to threats to my life, but I've never dealt with someone more animal than human. If all else fails, the silver should hold him at bay. He grimaced. He hadn't really expressed that right. He had no real intentions of seeking out Fenrir Greyback, and neither did he have any intention to fight the Whir. Mostly, he was more concerned about making sure the bastard knew to stop targeting him, and if he was lucky, he'd be able to subdue him long enough to get the appropriate people involved. Clearly, not the vampires, since they couldn't keep one of their mortal enemies contained, but neither the Ministry of Magic, since Greyback couldn't be charged for infecting others. It was a loophole in the law shamelessly exploited, the fact that charges couldn't be pressed by those considered something less than human, but it wasn't really Harry's concern. Theo would probably know who best to contact, and Harry made a mental note to ask the Slytherin. At least, he hoped his friend would, because otherwise, they'd be stuck up shit creek without a paddle, and Harry didn't want the threat of Greyback hanging over his head. Not when one lunatic, Voldemort, specifically, was enough for Harry to deal with. I mean, worst case scenario, he ambushes me in Hogsmeade, I lose my wand, blah blah blah. I do not want to become werewolf dinner, or a werewolf myself. Neville smiled slightly. That's understandable, Harry. I don't know anyone who'd want to be. But Merlin, you have the worst luck. I already knew that, Harry answered sardonically, such is my life, I guess. Their train ride remained uneventful, occupied with games of cards, of chess, or the occasional break to skim through homework and such things. They were visited sporadically by Susan and Justin, later by Theo and the Slytherin's friend, Blaise, and Harry took the opportunity to catch up on his peers' respective holidays. They varied. Zabini went to Italy, spent his Yule on his family's vineyard there, drinking wine and inundated by an excessive amount of Italian relatives. Theo spent his with his elderly grandfather. Justin went skiing in Japan, and Susan spent hers with her aunt. He wondered, morbidly, how many other families Voldemort had destroyed. Interestingly enough, Malfoy's customary visit was missed, though neither of the Gryffindors were about to look a gift horse in the mouth. Probably sulking about the fact that he's not going to be Lord Black, Neville commented snidely, and to Harry, the loathing was a surprise. Passive and mild-mannered, Neville didn't seem like the type to be so derisive. Harry knew, however, that looks could be deceiving. Thus, he shouldn't have been surprised. Also, Draco Malfoy was a wanker, and Neville was justified in his opinion of the Slytherin. Malfoy had made Neville's life at Hogwarts miserable, after all. It wouldn't surprise me, Harry conceded. I wonder if he'll make an issue of it. Neville's expression was flat. It's Malfoy. Harry met his gaze, groaned wearily, and grimaced. Of course Draco would make a big deal out of it. Harry probably wouldn't hear the end of the matter, in fact, until they graduated, if ever. It was just that, with other concerns on his mind, Harry didn't think he'd have the patience to tolerate Draco Malfoy and the silver spoon shoved up his ass. Chuckling at Harry's expression, Neville shuffled the deck of cards, dealt them each another hand, and they passed the remaining hour to Hogwarts with a game of wizarding poker. Apparently, Neville's great-uncle had taught it to the Longbottom heir during the Christmas of '92. Neville had taught it to Harry over the break just past, and unsurprisingly, the Gryffindor seeker was abysmal. When you get better at occlumency, hiding your expressions will become second nature, Neville encouraged. Harry eyed him, perplexed, and he elaborated, "What's the point in protecting your mind, if opponents can just read your thoughts all over your face?" Harry conceded the point with a nod. They reached Hogsmeade Station, and disembarked with the rest of their peers. Their carriage ride was unremarkable, the Dementors weren't missed, and Harry made a mental note to ask Lupin about a spell to ward off the depressing creatures. His reaction to them left much to be desired, and Harry didn't want that weakness to be exploited in future. The beginning of term feast was the same as all those before it, and Harry collapsed into bed later that night, tired. It had been a long, boring day, a prelude to the term ahead, and Harry wasn't looking forward to it in the slightest. It was perhaps the first time he'd never looked forward to his return to Hogwarts. Harry was in the library again. Susan and Theo were with him, tucked away in the philosophy section, each of them hunched over the same arithmancy homework. Their introduction to the subject had passed, the theoretical overview of numerology and spell crafting left behind with the end of their last term. Professor Vector had begun to introduce them to the nitty-gritty details of spell creation, had assigned them the task of dissecting a known spell into its numeric components, and Harry, his hair askew and his eyes bloodshot, had determined that the woman had been a sadist in another life. In contrast, Susan and Theo seemed to thrive under the challenge set for them, immersed in the task with a focus that might have been alarming if Harry hadn't come to expect it of them. They were both very enthusiastic about arithmancy, had gotten into rather heated debates regarding the matter, and blessedly, they were both willing to help Harry make sense of the subject, too. The fact was, Harry wasn't a born spell crafter. His magical affinity laid in defensive and offensive magic, regardless of medium. He was excellent in his wanded classes because of it, but beyond them, his innate understanding of ancient runes, and particularly, their relevance to warding and runic casting, was nothing to scoff at, either. He'd read in A Potter's Tale that he wasn't the first Potter similarly inclined, but due to the plainly exhausting workload he'd carried the term before, Harry hadn't spared much thought regarding the matter. With a groan, Harry dropped his head into his hand, sighed explosively, and squinted at the numeric equations in front of him. He'd chosen to do the Incendio spell for his arithmancy project, but somewhere in his equations, he wound up with the Aguamenti spell instead, and for the life of him, Harry couldn't figure out where he was going wrong. "Want help?" Susan queried. "Please." Harry offered Susan his journal. She scanned through his calculations with a critical eye, and pointed out his mistake with an encouraging grin. "You've got everything else right. You just mixed up the elemental numbers." Susan chuckled, and returned the journal to the Gryffindor's waiting hand. "You were overlooking the obvious, Harry. It doesn't have to be so complicated." "I'll believe it when I see it," Harry answered, tone light, and returned to his project. With Susan's input, however, he was done shortly thereafter, his numeric equations scrawled out on a clear roll of parchment, his 500-word personal reflection written out beneath it. With the other requisite details taken care of, Harry spelled the parchment dry, rolled it up, and bound it with twine. He was relieved to be done with the project, and Harry opted to enjoy the feeling while it lasted. By the following day, he would once again be immersed in his schoolwork, after all, and such reprieves were few and far between. With that in mind, Harry packed up his things, got to his feet, and bade his friends a good night. They waved to him in return. Harry retreated from the library, and shivered his way towards Gryffindor Tower. It was near the end of January, Hogwarts Castle was freezing, and the common room was rarely ever so appealing as it was in the middle of winter. "Did you get your project done?" Neville queried, settled across from Harry in an out-of-the-way corner of the common room. It was crowded, full of harassed OWL and NEWT students, of noisy first and second years, and a fair number of the other Gryffindors, too. The excess body heat, combined with the merry fire in the hearth, left the tower fairly toasty though, and in the dead of winter, Harry doubted anyone was about to complain. "Yeah," Harry confirmed, "Susan had to help me out, but it's finished, thank Godric. That's good, Neville acknowledged, though he didn't pursue the topic further. Instead, he returned to the Transfiguration homework Harry hadn't yet started. Left to his own devices, Harry withdrew, A Potter's Tale, from his bag, settled further into the wing-backed armchair he'd appropriated as his own, and continued to read up on his family history. The semester previous, he'd mostly skimmed through the text, too busy with his other, academic or extracurricular, pursuits. His withdrawal from 3 of his Saturday classes, and the temporary hiatus of Quidditch training, had left him a great deal of free time, however, and Harry was determined to learn, and understand, all that his grandfather's portrait had recommended for his future responsibilities. He came across the term, magical gray area, again, however, and despite the new outlook on his studies and such things, Harry still didn't know what it meant. Flitwick was more occupied with his practical spell casting. Things were still awkward in regards to he and Lupin's contrasting ideals in regards to Dumbledore, and he'd still not gotten around to asking one of his friends. As Harry glanced at Neville, though, he supposed that there was no time like the present. Neville, yeah, Harry, what does it mean when people refer to the magical gray area? Neville blinked, startled, and carefully set down his quill. Harry closed his book, and waited patiently as Neville sorted out his thoughts. There are 3 different magical areas. There's black magic, which is outlawed within the British Empire, and it includes fields such as necromancy, soul magic, and the unforgivables. They're considered black magic because of the taint it leaves on a person's mind, magic and their soul. On the other end of the spectrum, there's white magic. It includes most healing magics, and a number of powerful protection spells formed on the basis of unconditional, undying love. Finally, there's what you call the magical gray area. It is, essentially, all of the forms of magic that can't be defined as black or white. It's divided into light and dark, but regardless of shade, each element of magic in the gray area depends on intent. Intent, Harry echoed. He couldn't remember a time where Neville had said so much in one sitting, but it was rather interesting, and Harry was annoyed that he'd not asked his friend sooner. Intent, Neville confirmed. For instance, you can float someone off a cliff as easily as you can float a feather, if you want it enough. The same with an incendio spell. You can light a fire, or you can burn someone to death. It all depends on what you want, and how much you want it. Does that make sense? Yeah, mate, Harry answered, nodding thoughtfully, thanks for telling me. No problem. Neville gave him a smile, picked up his quill, and returned to his Transfiguration homework. Harry opened A Potter's Tale to a page somewhere in the middle, stared blankly at the words printed there, and absorbed all that his friend had told him. It all seemed rather straightforward, but Harry wondered about the labels of light and dark wizards. In the end, they were all shades of gray, and he wondered if such monikers mattered in the grand scheme of things. It didn't seem as though it should have, and yet, witches and wizards had been segregated into light and dark categories since Harry's first day back within the wizarding world, and generations of prejudice were hard to break besides. It was something to consider, he supposed. You all right? Neville inquired. Yeah, Harry answered, just thinking. Any questions? Nothing that can't wait, Harry assured. Neville shrugged his acquiescence. Harry contemplated A Potter's Tale, and resigned himself to more research. As with his questions, however, his research could wait, and until then, Harry opted to focus on other things. Before long, curfew fell, and the 2 third years retreated to their dormitory. Ron was already out like a light, but Dean and Seamus were at their respective study desks, absorbed into their own tasks. Neville and Harry left them to it. Harry readied for bed, and curled beneath his covers with an exhale of relief. When he fell asleep, his thoughts were on the concept of light and dark, and he wondered, bleakly, if it were possible to change so many generations of prejudice. Was it even worth it? It was one of the last days of January when Malfoy finally decided to make his displeasure known. Earlier, Harry had idly wondered if the Slytherin had been trying to lure him into a false sense of security, but whether or not that was the case, Harry hadn't dwelled on it. He'd been far too preoccupied with other things, after all, to concern himself with the woes of his schoolyard rival, and as the Slytherin finally confronted him, Harry found that he still didn't care at all. The day itself had been fairly standard. A Saturday, Harry had spent his morning in the library, and his afternoon in yet another deportment lesson. An arduous training session with Professor Flitwick had followed, and by the end of it, Harry was famished and eager for dinner. He'd been on his way there, in fact, when Malfoy had blocked his path, the sanctimonious wanker. Resigned, Harry stopped in his tracks, sighed impatiently, and glared. "What do you want, Malfoy?" "I demand an honor duel," said Draco, expression indecipherable. There was loathing, certainly, and no small degree of arrogance, but there was something else too, something dangerous, and Harry's shoulders stiffened, wary. "On what grounds?" Harry retorted. Neville, who'd come from the Great Hall when he'd caught wind of the commotion, drifted to Harry's side, and waited patiently. As he did, Harry thought over what he knew of honor duels. He'd researched them extensively after the trophy room fiasco of his first year, but more recently, Professor Flitwick had explained to him the finer details, too. Harry knew that he could refuse on the grounds of differing social status. He was even tempted to, but if he did, it would call into question his own honor, and Harry was uncertain of whether or not his relative well-being was worth that indignity, not to mention the long-term ramifications. And then, of course, there was his pride, which Harry had in spades. "I find it offensive that a half-blood has been named heir of the ancient and noble House of Black." "Well, I find it offensive that a descendant of Norman peasants is questioning my worth as the Black heir," Harry retorted. The crowds surrounding them, lower-year students of all four houses, collectively oohed, and Malfoy grew flustered. Harry wasn't pleased by the attention either, though he wasn't sure what the Slytherin had honestly expected in the middle of the entrance hall. "Do you accept, Potter?" Harry's gaze scanned their onlookers, found Theo in the crowd, and arched an expectant eyebrow. Theo nodded once, Harry nodded his acknowledgement, and turned back to his adversary. "Name your terms, Malfoy." The Slytherin did so, a satisfied smirk on his face. Harry reciprocated afterwards. They each named their seconds, Neville for Harry, Crabbe for Malfoy, and a location was organized. It was a far cry from the juvenile posturing of their first year, but all the same, Harry thought it rather ironic that once again, the trophy room was their location of choice, though at dawn this time around. Eventually, the terms were agreed upon. Harry and Draco shook hands reluctantly and the students went their separate ways. "Do you think you're prepared for it?" Neville inquired. They'd entered the Great Hall by then, seated at the Gryffindor house table, and surrounded by peers. Harry didn't know. He was able to hold his own against Professor Flitwick for 5 minutes, but he wasn't certain how that would correlate against a fellow third year. He also didn't know how much dueling experience Malfoy had, if any, but at the end of the day, all Harry could do was try his best, and to let the cards fall where they may. At the very least, Harry wasn't at risk of compromising his status as serious heir presumptive, or as the heir apparent of the House of Potter. He'd have refused, otherwise, consequences be damned. That kind of power in Draco Malfoy's hands. Over his dead body. Small favors, he supposed. "I guess I'll find out," he acknowledged, served himself some dinner, and added, "I'll have to talk with Theo." "Probably a good idea," Neville concurred. "He'll likely have information regarding Malfoy's abilities, if nothing else." Harry made to reply with his agreement, but before he could, Hermione dropped into the seat across from him, and glared. Harry eyed her, puzzled. "What, did you not learn from last time, Harry James Potter?" As Harry frowned, he also marveled at how quickly news traveled. He wasn't impressed, however, with Hermione's confrontational attitude, and also with the fact that she jumped directly towards the wrong conclusions. Furthermore, he wasn't impressed that she'd chosen to act upon those conclusions without acquiring all of the facts. "Do you understand the concept of an honor duel, Hermione?" The girl bristled, straightened her back, and glowered at Neville. She seemed insulted by the perceived slight to her intelligence, but Neville continued speaking, heedless of her expression. He'd come a long way from the timid boy of years prior, and it had never been more obvious. Draco Malfoy called into question Harry's worth as the heir of the ancient and noble House of Black. He called for an honor duel to prove his superiority, and such insults should never be taken lightly, especially not by Harry. To refuse was to call into question his own honor, and those slights are never forgotten. They're banned in Hogwarts, and furthermore, do you not remember what happened last time? Harry grimaced. I'm certain I could never forget it, Hermione. You didn't need to remind me. With that said, that particular incident has no bearing on the current circumstances. Disregarding the fact that last time wasn't even genuine, there's a lot more at stake now. It's not just a schoolyard grudge anymore, he's made it political and personal. How? Harry sighed. He really wasn't interested in explaining what he'd, somehow, had interpreted without conscious thought. The fact was, Malfoy had said he was unworthy of the status of Sirius heir on the grounds that Harry was a half-blood. To refuse the duel, regardless of the disparities in social status, would imply that Harry thought himself unworthy, or something like it. Given the current prejudice in regards to blood status, among other things, it would be a boon for the pureblood agenda that Harry couldn't, and wouldn't, chance. He already had too much to worry about, after all, and at least once the duel was done, he wouldn't have to worry about it further. Neville explained it instead. Harry cast his friend a grateful glance, ate his dinner in contemplative silence, and afterwards, he excused himself from the table, and left the hall. Neville accompanied him, and slowly, they wandered towards he and Theo's usual practice room. Unsurprisingly, Theo was already there, waiting. What is he playing at? Harry questioned, bitter. He wants you humiliated, Theo answered, wants the Conservatives to call into question your worth as heir Black. He doesn't realize you've been mentored by Professor Flitwick since September. Has he had any training? Neville queried, his expression curiously bland. Only the basics. You're a great deal quicker than him, and your spell repertoire is better, too. You shouldn't have a problem. He won't dare cheat, not in an honor duel. If he does, he can key his own reputation goodbye. You should probably have your house elf, Totsi, monitor the trophy room tonight though. Just in case. Harry nodded in acknowledgement of his friend's words, and the trio spoke for a time. Before long, however, curfew drew near, and the Gryffindors retreated towards their common room, thoughts already on the following dawn. Wizards' duels between amateurs were awkward. Duels between experts were generally a chaotic exchange of unspoken spells and evasive maneuvers, and the occasional conversation, too. In contrast, duels between amateurs generally consisted of a pair of wizards taking turns flinging spells at each other, with the hope that one would eventually hit. Suffice to say, Harry wasn't particularly anticipating his. Do you think he'll cheat? Harry glanced up from the fireplace, carded a hand through his hair, and shrugged. His great-aunt Cassiopeia would have glared her disapproval, but with his thoughts on the confrontation to come, Harry couldn't bring himself to care. Instead, he contemplated what he knew about Draco Malfoy, which, upon reflection, was not much at all, and sighed. I wouldn't put it past him, Harry conceded, with the possible repercussions though, it's hard to say. Neville nodded his agreement, but offered Harry an encouraging grin. If Malfoy cheats, I'll make sure everyone knows it. Hopefully, he's smart enough to recognize the consequences if he does. Harry snorted, derisive. Have you ever known Draco Malfoy to do anything smart in regards to Gryffindors, Neville? Neville conceded the point with a nod and a reluctant grin. Touché. Nearby, Dean set down his homework. Neville had been helping Dean and Seamus with their herbology, but that had been an hour ago, and Dean had grown bored. Are you nervous? Harry shrugged nonchalantly. Even with all the social repercussions an honor duel guaranteed, it was hard to feel nervous about it. Not when basilisks, Voldemort, and even Professor Flitwick, offered more of a threat than Draco Malfoy ever could. It was overconfident, perhaps, even arrogant, to a certain degree, but it was hard not to feel that way. Not really. Maybe I will later. You'll trounce him, Seamus acknowledged. Stupid wanker will deserve it, too. Of course he will, Neville agreed. Harry couldn't decide if he'd been referring to Malfoy, or to Harry himself, and the Potter Scion didn't ask. Instead, he gathered up his things, bade his friends a good night, and retreated to his dorm room. He wasn't sure if he'd actually be able to get to sleep, but he'd have to be up before dawn, and Harry figured there was no harm in trying. Thus, he readied for bed and set an alarm, climbed beneath his covers, and was out like a light. It took Harry about 25 seconds after he'd woken up to regret the fact their duel was before dawn. At the end of January, in the Scottish Highlands, before the sun was up, the temperature was freezing, and inside a drafty stone castle, it was even colder. To back out was cowardice, however, and though a lot of things could be said about him, cowardice wasn't one of them. "Bloody hell," Neville muttered, bundled up and shivering. "I thought snakes were supposed to hate the cold." "That's not funny," Harry replied, though he was chuckling, and Neville's grin was unapologetic. "Do you reckon we should take the cloak and risk getting it confiscated?" Neville replied, "I don't think so. We should probably just go the old-fashioned way." Harry nodded his acquiescence, approached the portrait hole, and stepped into the corridor beyond. Neville followed suit, and the pair reached the trophy room without ado. When they did, Totsie popped into existence beside Harry, and Neville nearly jumped out of his skin. "Merlin, Totsie," Neville gasped, "you scared the life out of me." "Totsie is being sorry," she replied. "Totsie is also being reporting to Master Harry. There is being no mischief in the night." "All right, Totsie," Harry acknowledged, still chuckling at Neville's expense. "Thanks for doing this. You can go get some rest now." His house elf popped out of sight. Harry slumped into a corner and yawned. He was conditioned to early mornings, but he wasn't fond of the cold, and neither was he fond of waiting. It was, however, an unfortunate necessity, and Harry wasn't about to risk his, and serious, honor besides. "What's the time?" Neville queried. Harry glanced at his watch. It was an old, beat-up timepiece he'd salvaged from Dudley's second bedroom, and Harry had no reason to replace it. It wasn't broken, after all, and without any sentimental value, the Gryffindor wouldn't be fussed if it was damaged. "It's 5:15, Harry determined, shoved his hands under his arms, and contemplated the trophies in the light of his wand. "We did say 20 past, didn't we?" "Yeah," Neville confirmed. "Maybe he ran into Filch." Harry chuckled. If that was the case, the irony would kill him. Maybe he decided to back out. Maybe he's plotting ways to secretly kill you. Maybe he's telling his father. They met gazes and laughed, the snorting, irrepressible kind that made Harry's stomach ache. There was no reason to, really, but even as he tried, Harry couldn't stop laughing, and neither could his friend. That wouldn't surprise me," Neville chortled. Harry wiped away tears of mirth, employed his meager occlumency skills to collect himself, and breathed deeply. "Where are they?" Neville shrugged. "I don't know." Outside, the sound of shuffling footsteps neared the door. It opened marginally, Crabbe squeezed through the opening, and Malfoy followed a few moments later. Neville cleared his throat in the silence. Harry stepped from his place in the shadows, and between the four, the tension was palpable. "Should we go over the terms, then?" Neville queried. Harry, as he rolled his familiar holly and phoenix feather wand between his thumb and forefinger, nodded jerkily, and Malfoy did the same. They didn't take his eyes off of Harry, wary and guarded and hateful, and Harry kept his own gaze on the, disturbed by the amount of loathing in Malfoy's expression. He'd seen it in Snape, in Voldemort and in a young Tom Riddle, but it seemed wrong, out of place, on the juvenile features of a fellow 13-year-old boy. "Shield, petrification, stunning, binding, and disarming spells only," Harry intoned flatly. "The first to yield, to be incapacitated, or to be disarmed loses," Malfoy contributed. "Opponents may each only use one wand," Harry added. "Regardless of outcome, the duel is not to be talked about afterwards, and the slight shall be settled." It had been a stipulation Harry had insisted on. He didn't need the scrutiny, and furthermore, he definitely didn't want to put up with another honor duel. Malfoy had acquiesced, albeit begrudgingly, and there was only one more term. The prize is satisfaction, and nothing more. It was another term Harry had insisted on. Otherwise, Malfoy would have been able to contest Harry's designation as the Lord Black's heir presumptive, and in retrospect, Harry wondered if that was what Malfoy had wanted in the first place. It wouldn't have surprised him, in all honesty. "Good," Neville acknowledged, clapped his hands together once, and pointed out the temporary square Harry had Totsie outline the night before. "That's the dueling platform. Keep in mind, if you take one step out of line, you're immediately forfeit." Of course, Harry acknowledged, took a few steps inwards from a corner of the square, and watched as Malfoy did the same across from him. As he did so, Neville stepped up behind Harry, scrutinized the Slytherin briefly, and queried, "You all right?" "Yeah," Harry confirmed, adjusted the grip of his wand in his hand, and waited. "All right," Neville began, projecting his voice, "since you're not starting at the center, Bo." Harry did so, neither deeply or shallowly, but enough to appear respectful, and most certainly not enough to lose sight of his opponent. Then they both straightened up, and Neville spoke again. "Begin." Malfoy's first volley went wide. Harry's spells were blocked by the Slytherin's conjured shield. Though was actually fairly good, his spells quick and his shield sturdy, but his aim was off, and Harry used it to his advantage. He moved consistently, throwing off Malfoy's aim, and when the Slytherin was flustered, Harry moved onto the offense. After that, the duel was embarrassingly short. Malfoy was stunned into unconsciousness, and as per the terms, he lost. Harry revived him. Neville determined the outcome, Crabbe reluctantly concurred, and the two groups went their separate ways. "I was kind of waiting for that all term," Neville admitted. "It was anticlimactic." "I know," Harry acknowledged. Something tells me it's not the last duel I'll have with Draco Malfoy." Neville met Harry's gaze, his expression grim. "You really think so? You think he will?" Harry shrugged, his expression bleak. "I don't know." And the uncertainty, Harry knew, would plague him. All he could do, however, was to wait and see. Perhaps he'd be wrong, but the loathing on Malfoy's face was unmistakable, and Harry couldn't forget it. He wouldn't let himself. Once again, Harry found himself in the library with Susan. As per usual, they were tucked away in the philosophy section, and between bites of his smuggled apple and Susan's chocolate frog, and as they procrastinated with regards to an essay set by McGonagall, Harry assisted Susan with her ancient runes, and Susan assisted Harry with his arithmancy. Normally, Theo made an effort to join them, but that afternoon, he'd begged off with the excuse that he was in need of Blaise Zabini's potions expertise, and both had understood. With regards to potions, Zabini was probably the best in their year. It drove Hermione and a select number of Ravenclaws mental, but it was undeniable, and if Harry cared the slightest for his potions grades, he'd probably be seeking Zabini's aid, too. As it was, Snape was borderline failing him, and Harry had given up on trying to please the greasy bastard ages ago. Guess what? Harry eyed Susan, mildly wary. She'd adopted that bright-eyed, giggly look that Lavender and Parvati got when they'd acquired a new piece of gossip, and that generally spelled trouble for any unfortunate male in their vicinity. "What? Wayne asked me to Hogsmeade for Valentine's Day." Okay. Wayne Hopkins was another Hufflepuff in their year. He was fairly quiet, and his closest friend was Ernie Macmillan. Harry didn't know him well, and he'd probably had one conversation with the other third year, but apparently, he fancied Susan, and Harry wasn't really sure how he should feel about that. Mostly, he was just confused about why she was telling him. It was his understanding that such topics were reserved for conversations between girlfriends, and as Harry had observed, Susan had no shortage of those. "Harry, I've been hoping he'd ask me since September." "Okay," Harry acknowledged, "I'm happy for you." As Susan began to babble about how Wayne had asked her, and what she hoped would happen on their date, and what she thought she might wear, Harry spaced out, and considered the upcoming Hogsmeade weekend. Sirius had signed his permission slip over the winter holidays, and thus, Harry would actually be going, but he wondered if he should take a date, too. He was doubtful, but it seemed a number of his classmates had dates, and Harry didn't want to be considered an oddity once again. As it was, Seamus had plans with Lavender, and Dean had plans with Parvati, and even Theo had lunch plans with a girl in Slytherin by the name of Tracy Davis. It bared further consideration, but as Susan asked about his own Valentine's Day plans, Harry determined that now was neither the time, nor the place. "I didn't have anything in mind," Harry admitted. "I don't really fancy anyone, you know." Susan shrugged. "Maybe think about it. No one likes to be alone, after all." Harry grunted. So long as he didn't receive another singing Valentine, he was pretty sure he didn't care either way. Susan was likely to pester him ceaselessly if he admitted that, however, and thus he kept quiet instead, returned his attention to his ancient runes homework, and sighed an internal breath of relief when the Hufflepuff followed suit. He was distracted some time later by the appearance of Professor Lupin in the philosophy section. The defense professor had not visited in a while, and although Harry wasn't certain if it was because he'd found what he'd been searching for, or because he was avoiding Harry, the Gryffindor had reasoned that it was none of his business. Regardless, he was left oddly flat-footed by Lupin's reappearance, and Susan was no help whatsoever. "Back again, Professor Lupin." "I am," Lupin acknowledged lightly. "I've been pondering a lot of big questions recently." "Ugh," Susan grimaced. "How can you deal with it, Professor?" "I hate not having definitive answers for anything. You learn to appreciate them over time," he answered. "It's all a matter of perspective, I believe." Lupin met Harry's gaze then, and Harry got the impression he was referring to a lot more than just philosophy. Their last serious conversation weighed heavy between them, and Harry bowed his head in acknowledgement of the man's words. They left him with a lot to think about, and suddenly, ancient runes wasn't nearly as riveting as it had been only a few moments earlier. "Are you okay?" Susan queried. Lupin was gone. Harry managed a smile. "Why wouldn't I be?" Susan eyed him, unconvinced, but she didn't pursue the matter. Harry, meanwhile, tried and failed to focus on his homework, eventually conceded defeat, and withdrew a novel to pass the time. "You've gotten much better," Professor Flitwick commended. "I'm impressed by your elemental charms." Harry managed a smile. He was breathless, having just had his ass handed to him again, but his charms professor's compliments were always appreciated, and it was always nice to know others could see his improvement. He'd worked hard to reach his current skill level, and although he was by no means an expert, he was far better than when he'd started. These days, he could hold his own against Professor Flitwick for upwards of 7 minutes, and the Ravenclaw head of house had very few critiques regarding his form. Given that he'd been absolutely abysmal to begin with, the acknowledgement was rather gratifying. There's always room for improvement, of course, but that will come with time, and practice, naturally. How have you found that tome I loaned you? Harry spared a moment to consider his answer. The Compendium of Curses by Phalanx Docios was predominantly a spell book, from which he'd learned a variety of jinxes, hexes, and curses. From what Harry understood, the content spanned the entirety of what was recognized as the magical gray area, without prejudice, and although he'd been initially wary, Harry had taken to the magic with startling ease. He never used the spells outside of practice, because in Hogwarts, he had no reason to. That said, he'd learned an extensive amount of the book's theoretical content, and a growing amount of its practical content, too. It's quite interesting, Harry determined. A lot of those spells are designed for wide-range combat though, as opposed to a one-on-one duel. Indeed, Flitwick agreed. In my experience, however, Lord Voldemort and his Death Eaters had a certain fondness for outnumbering their opponents. I believe it would behoove you to learn spells for any kind of combative scenario. Have you ever considered battle transfiguration? Transmutation, perhaps. It isn't a well-known fact, but Professor McGonagall is quite accomplished in both fields. I had considered it, Harry admitted, I just didn't have the time. Maybe next year, if things aren't so chaotic, I'll ask, but for now, I figure I'll focus on what I'm already working on. That is perhaps for the best, Flitwick acknowledged. In any case, it is your choice to make. Just know that you do have options. Harry's smile was small. I'll keep that in mind, Professor. Thanks, though. Don't mention it, Harry. Now, how do you feel about another duel? Do I have a choice? Flitwick's grin was all teeth. Not in the slightest. Harry grimaced, dodged the disarming spell sent his way, and shielded himself against the steady barrage of minor jinxes and hexes that followed. He retaliated when he could, but for the most part, Flitwick kept him on the defensive, and until Harry was disarmed, that was where he stayed. Room for improvement, indeed. Even in the midst of February, Hogsmeade looked like a gingerbread village come to life. It was all rustic cottages and storefronts, with snow-covered roofs and streets paved by sandstone. It was quaint, like a postcard picture, or a travel magazine's Christmas special, and despite himself, Harry was amused. "The Three Broomsticks is packed," Neville muttered, no surprise, there. "Is there anywhere else we can go?" Harry queried, hands buried in his pockets, face in his scarf. "It's bloody freezing." Neville hesitated. "There's the Hog's Head, I guess." Harry shivered. "Sounds good. Lead the way." The Hog's Head was, more or less, the antithesis of the Three Broomsticks. Where the latter was warm and welcoming, the former was decrepit and dreary, with questionable clientele and a cantankerous bartender. It was out of the cold though, and it sold warm apple cinnamon ciders, and Harry supposed he couldn't complain. Seated at the bar, Harry sipped at his drink, picked at a bowl of chips, and watched disinterestedly as Neville fiddled with a galleon. His attention, however, was diverted by the distasteful rambling of a vagrant 2 stools down, who seemed to have something against werewolves, and one werewolf in particular. "Word is, Greyback's headed this way, the mongrel. Hope he knows that when he gets here, he'll be met with a lot more than just innocent children to bite. The ministry should have put that beast, and the rest of his kind, down years ago. They're a plague on society." The stranger's rant continued, but Harry tuned him out, and instead turned to Neville, expression grim. The news wasn't much of a surprise, but it was still unwelcome, and Harry was uncertain of how he ought to proceed. The irony was that there was an entire school full of children that Fenrir Greyback could take chunks out of, and Harry wondered what the beast, was playing at. Perhaps he'd simply lost his mind. Either way, the wizarding community would have his head for encroaching on Hogwarts territory. Should probably let Theo know, at least, Neville reasoned. He probably has as much cause to watch his back as you do. The teachers, too, Harry contributed. Riley, he added, though I can't guarantee they'll actually listen. He recalled, vividly, his conversation with Professor McGonagall from years earlier, their warning, her dismissal, and the life-threatening adventure that had followed. He didn't hold his head of house at fault, though he knew beyond reasonable doubt that the entire debacle could have been dealt with a lot more quietly if she'd only listened. Spilt milk, he supposed, and opted not to dwell on it. Instead, he finished the rest of his cider, ate the last of his chips, and walked with Neville back to the castle. As he did, the dagger tucked into his boot weighed heavy on his mind, and Harry dreaded the day he would have to use it. Now more than ever, it felt like an inevitability, and the thought left him hollow. Was he prepared for that sort of confrontation? Harry didn't think so. "Do you think he's back in the castle yet?" Neville queried. Harry shook his head, no. Theo had informed Harry of his plans with Tracy, and although Harry had been far from interested, he'd registered enough to know that the two Slytherins wouldn't return until early evening. That was, of course, provided nothing went wrong, but Harry opted not to concern himself with that possibility. It was none of his business, after all, and neither did he want it to be. He won't be back until later. Let's go tell a teacher, yeah. Neville shrugged his acquiescence, and queried Riley, which one? They hesitated in the entrance hall, and each considered the possibilities. Snape was out of the question, unsurprisingly, but if the rest of the core faculty was to be taken into consideration, that left McGonagall, Sprout, Flitwick and Lupin. They each had their benefits and drawbacks, but eventually, the two Gryffindors settled on simply telling the first teacher they found. Perhaps ironically, that person happened to be Professor Lupin. Things hadn't yet been resolved with the man. Not completely, anyway, but some things took precedent over a difference of opinion, and Harry didn't have the time or inclination to be picky. "Can we speak with you a minute, Professor?" Neville requested. "It's important." Lupin eyed them speculatively for a moment, nodded, and led the way to his office. He had yet another weird magical creature stored away for class, but as Harry dropped himself into an available seat, and as Neville did the same nearby, Harry paid it no heed. Instead, he contemplated what he ought to tell the man, carded a hand through his hair, and exhaled roughly. Meanwhile, Neville firmed his resolve, and took the brutally honest approach. "Professor, we have reason to believe that Fenrir Greyback is on his way to Hogwarts." Lupin simultaneously blanched and reeled backwards in his seat. He collected himself admirably quickly, however, cleared his throat, and briefly, longingly contemplated an empty tumbler on his desk. Then he shook himself, breathed slowly, and addressed them both. "What makes you think that, Neville?" "Harry, that'll be because of me, Professor," Harry contributed, and without prompting, proceeded with the explanation of his encounter with Greyback in August, and later, his encounter with Sanguini over the winter holidays. He concluded with what he and Neville had overheard in the Hog's Head, and when he was done, he sighed a breath of relief that the telling was over. After the Dowager Lady Longbottom, and before her, even, Harry hadn't had any intention of telling anyone about it, really. Until now, anyway, because now, he wasn't the only one in trouble. Circumstances had changed, Greyback had likely lost the plot, and if reliving those nightmares could help keep his peers safe, then he could live with a few moments of personal discomfort. How could he do anything less? There was a brief flash of animalistic fury on his face, but again, the man collected himself impressively fast, took a moment to calm down, and stared out of his window as he did so. Then he sighed, briefly eyed his tumbler once again, and determined, "I think it's time we spoke with Headmaster Dumbledore." Harry didn't hate Albus Dumbledore. He wasn't particularly fond of the man, and the general public's blind faith in him made Harry exceedingly uncomfortable, but hatred would require an opinion, and that was something Harry didn't have. He was, more or less, apathetic. At least, with regards to the man himself. With regards to the way he ran Hogwarts. That was a different matter entirely. Suffice to say, Dumbledore had dropped the ball on that front, and World War I veterans weren't the only wizards disappointed with what Hogwarts had become. Nevertheless, Harry could see the reason behind Lupin's decision, though he didn't much like it. He didn't complain, however. Instead, he trailed behind Lupin, and Neville stayed by his side. "What do you think he'll do?" Neville queried. Harry didn't have the foggiest idea. He wasn't holding his breath, however. Age and acquired wisdom aside, this was the same man who'd allowed a Cerberus and a troll in the castle, who'd not closed the school when it was under threat of a basilisk, and who'd done essentially nothing against the threat of Dementors on their doorstep. The latter, Harry willfully admitted, wasn't Dumbledore's fault, but the teen remembered, quite vividly, the ill-fated Quidditch game that had lost him his broom. Surely, there was something Dumbledore could have done to guarantee his students' safety. Then again, perhaps there wasn't. "Your guess is as good as mine, Nev," Harry answered, and in front of them, Lupin reached the gargoyle that guarded Dumbledore's office. The password was uttered, the spiral staircase was ascended, and Lupin raised a fist to knock. On the other side of the door, Dumbledore preempted him. "Enter." Lupin did so, and the two Gryffindors reluctantly trailed in behind him. Unsurprisingly, Dumbledore was seated behind his desk, elbows propped on the aged wood, fingers steepled in front of him. He gazed at them over his half-moon spectacles, a benign smile on his face, and Harry suppressed the reflex to card a hand through his hair. Despite himself, he was nervous. "Headmaster," Lupin greeted, and gestured for the teens to seat themselves in the available chairs. They did so in silence, and waited. "Harry and Neville have come to me with some concerning news." "Indeed?" Dumbledore queried, and his smile dimmed. "It concerns the safety of the school," Lupin continued, "and I'm inclined to believe them." Dumbledore arched a snowy eyebrow, and turned his cornflower gaze on Harry and Neville. Both avoided direct eye contact, and upon Dumbledore's prompting, Harry explained once again. Afterwards, they sat in silence. "As much as I commend you for your stellar display of honor and courage, Harry, this news is troubling, indeed." Harry bit back an acerbic, and entirely unnecessary, retort, nodded his agreement, and sighed a quiet breath of relief when both he and Neville were dismissed. They'd passed on the message, and the problem for the school's safety was out of their hands. And still, Harry worried. "Is it my fault, Neville?" Neville came to a screeching halt beside Harry, and the latter belatedly followed suit. He looked at his broader friend, who seemed aghast that he'd asked, and eyed him, confused by the delay. "Are you mad, Harry? Of course it's not your fault, you dolt. The responsibility lays at Greyback's feet, and no one else's." "But if you hadn't, then Theo would be dead," Neville answered, and the brutal honesty was enough to derail Harry from his spiral into self-loathing and pity. A part of Harry still blamed himself, certainly, but it wasn't all-consuming, and Harry wouldn't let it define him. Not again, and not when his actions had saved Theo's life. Right, Harry acknowledged, cleared his throat, and added, "Thanks, Neville." "No problem," Neville replied, and they continued on their way. What are friends for? When Harry found Theo that evening, the latter was playing a solo game of gobstones in the classroom they'd appropriated as a training room, but one that was also used when either of them wanted some time away from the rest of the school. More often than not, Theo just used it to get away from Draco Malfoy, but Harry had taken advantage of the quietude a time or two, and he wasn't about to begrudge his friend his solitude. That said, he was mildly concerned by the expression on the taller Slytherin's features. It was a strange combination of resigned acceptance and despair, and Harry had no idea what to make of it. "Theo." "Hello," Theo greeted, tone weary. "What's the matter?" "Nothing." Harry stared, unconvinced, and Theo relented. "Nothing I'm prepared to talk about." With a nod of concession, Harry dropped into an available chair, stretched his legs out in front of him, and yawned, exhausted despite himself. He considered ways he could tell the Slytherin, and eventually determined that there was no easy way of doing so. "Neville and I overheard some information in the Hog's Head today. It's about Greyback." Without conscious thought, Theo's hand reached towards the throwing knife he kept strapped to his left forearm, and Harry looked away. He felt guilty. Again. And this time, he wasn't sure if it was because Greyback was headed to Hogwarts, or because he was inadvertently bursting Theo's bubble of unwitting bliss. "What is it?" Harry answered, and Theo went a disturbing shade of pale. He looked sickly, actually, and Harry warily watched to make sure his friend wasn't about to vomit, or pass out, or to fall into a state of shock. He wasn't sure if the latter was possible, but neither did he want to find out. Harry didn't have to worry though, because after the surprise wore off, Theo got angry, and his fist had an unceremonious meeting with the wall. The Slytherin's unintelligible cry of unrelenting fury became a litany of pained expletives in English, Italian and French. Meanwhile, Harry took hold of his friend's shoulder, and led the familiar way to the infirmary. When the alternative was a state of incandescent fury, Harry was almost certain he'd have preferred the shock. Harry couldn't speak for Theo, but the paranoia was getting to him. These days, every unexplainable shadow was a threat, every rustle of wind on his neck was the whisper of pungent breath against his skin, and with every night that passed, Fenrir Greyback drew ever nearer. It was exhausting, and Harry was fairly certain he'd acquired a crick in his neck from how often he'd looked over his shoulder, and yet, life went on, the world kept turning, and nothing had changed. "What do you know about Greyback?" Harry queried. He was seated on one of the school's available balconies, feet perched on the stone railing, gaze on the pale blue sky overhead. Winter had drawn to a close, and with its end, Oliver Wood had restarted training with a vengeance. Naturally, the rest of the Quidditch team had been dragged along for the ride. It had swallowed up much of his free time, but he'd grown close with his team over the years, and their company was welcome. The early mornings, the windburn, and Oliver's tangents, however, were not. "Why?" Theo questioned, gaze squinted against the sunlight, his personal arithmancy journal in his lap. He'd already started with a few basic spell creation attempts, but thus far, they'd each been met with little success. His friend, however, was not deterred. "Know thy enemy," Harry quoted, "enlighten me." After a moment's contemplation, Theo acquiesced with a shrug, closed his journal, and leant back against the stone behind him. He likes to turn young children, take them in as his pack, and convert them to his, us against them, mentality. No one knows how old he is, but he's trained in magic, and the general consensus is that he was turned sometime after he finished school. It's also assumed that Fenrir Greyback isn't his real name, though if that's the case, there's no telling what is. "What about his pack? Do you know much about them?" "Not really. They're very insular, and although a fair few werewolves who don't buy into Greyback's mentality have tried to gather information, they've not been very successful. What's known is that as of December 1992, there are at least 23 werewolves in Greyback's pack, and there's no telling how many he's bitten since. Also, he's patient, he watches, gathers information, and waits. If it's revenge, then he'll always attack on the full moon. If it's standard hunting, then he'll attack in human form, and he'll leave visible scars behind. A calling card, if you will. Also, it's weird. What is? Without the influence of wolfsbane, most werewolves are mindless during the full moon. Greyback though, it's like his human mind is so completely mixed with the wolf's, so it doesn't matter what form he's in, he'll always have control over his actions. Do you think he's watching us now? Harry queried, a wry tilt to his smile. Theo was entirely serious when he answered, I have no doubt about it. Harry didn't let himself contemplate Theo's answers, and instead focused on his assignments. The teachers had inundated the Hogwarts student body with assessment, and as the mid-semester break drew nearer, tensions were high. Not only were assignments due in, but the Gryffindor and Slytherin Quidditch match was a week away, and the amount of resulting violence had reached new heights. Also, Newt and Owl exams drew close, which guaranteed the 5th and 7th years were in a tailspin, and although it didn't affect Harry directly, he was frequently left wondering if he would wind up the unfortunate witness of a meltdown, courtesy of Angelina and Orlicia. On top of the Fenrir Greyback mess, it made for a stressful time, and Harry didn't think he'd ever looked forward to a school holiday so much in his life. He wasn't going home, wherever that was, these days, but for a week. It would be nice not to have to worry about classes, or homework, or Oliver's Quidditch madness. Do you think Dumbledore's done anything? If he has, it's not obvious, Harry replied, and I doubt he'd tell me. Harry was a student of Hogwarts, after all, and Dumbledore's responsibility besides. The last 2 school years notwithstanding, he had no real business knowing details regarding the school's security. More or less an amateur concerning magic, that kind of information would make him a liability, and it was a hefty burden to bear. He was glad he didn't know, but still, he wondered. Was Hogwarts prepared for Fenrir Greyback? Was he? At the end of yet another defense against the dark arts class, Harry approached Lupin's desk, his arms weighted down with books. They were the texts Lupin had loaned Harry earlier that year, and after 5 months, Harry was fairly certain he'd learned all he could from their pages. Moreover, it felt somewhat awkward to hold on to them while things were so uncertain between them. Harry, Lupin greeted, eyed the texts in Harry's arms with a wry smile, and observed, finished with those already. Yes, Professor, he confirmed, I figured you'd like them back. Lupin nodded absently, deposited them on his desk, and settled back in the seat behind it. He contemplated Harry for a time, eyebrows furrowed in thought, and then sighed wearily. Professor, will you sit, Harry? Harry nodded, dragged one of the student chairs over, and dropped his book bag by his feet. Then he sat, clasped his hands in his lap, and waited. There is much that Albus Dumbledore has done for me over the years, Lupin began, and it is very easy to forget that not all have had such support. I would like to apologize for my behavior in previous meetings, and moreover, to acknowledge that you have every reason to be skeptical regarding Dumbledore's character. In fact, I commend you for it. In this world, one should never take anything at face value. Lupin trailed off then, his expression regretful. Harry wondered if his thoughts were on Sirius, though he didn't ask. Instead, he offered the werewolf a smile and a nonchalant shrug, and offered up an apology of his own. I'm sorry I didn't respect your opinion. I understand that everyone is entitled to their own, but it seemed I forgot for a while. Lupin shrugged, and answered sagely, it happens. Harry grinned, a weight off his shoulders, and queried, was that all, Professor? Not quite, Lupin answered, though I do recognize that I'm holding you from your lunch. Will you stop by my office after classes today? Sure, Harry acquiesced, gathered his bag and returned the chair to its rightful place, and approached the door. He bade Lupin a good afternoon, left the classroom, and made his way to the Great Hall. You're ditching me, Susan determined, I see how it is. You don't love me anymore. You're mental, Sue, Harry answered, laughing, and shuffled out of the arithmancy classroom behind Theo. How does Hopkins feel about having a girlfriend who's bonkers? He likes my crazy, Susan replied, but in all seriousness, do you know why Lupin wants to see you? No idea. If Harry had to guess, however, Greyback seemed a likely reason. Or Sirius, though if it was the latter, Harry couldn't fathom why his godfather wouldn't just contact him by owl. Guess I'll find out though. Hey, maybe I'll even let you know. You'd better. Susan laughed, especially if he's giving pointers for the Dada exam in May. Not bloody likely, Red. A girl can dream, right? Harry shrugged, and tugged the strap of his bag higher on his shoulder. They'd reached the point where their paths diverged. Susan bade him the best of luck, and while she followed Theo towards the library, Harry made his way towards Professor Lupin's office. The man himself was stood by his window, gaze on the forbidden forest, but his mind apparently a million miles away. Professor Lupin, startled, turned, and relaxed upon sight of the Gryffindor. Harry, you surprised me. Harry arched a bemused eyebrow, and replied, you wanted to see me after classes. Lupin nodded, mildly dazed, and shuffled towards his desk. I remember. Take a seat, make yourself comfortable. Would you like some tea? Harry accepted the offer with a murmured, thank you, sipped it quietly, and watched silently as Lupin seemed to think over what he wanted to say. Harry didn't know his defense against the dark arts professor well, but the man had an expressive face, and he was clearly troubled. I'm concerned, Lupin began. Fenrir Greyback is a very dangerous adversary, and I'm uncertain of your ability to defend yourself against him. I wanted to help prepare you for any possible encounter you may have with him. He offered Harry a wry smile. You and I both know that the protections around Hogwarts aren't infallible, after all. That was rather unexpected. It was humbling, certainly, because if Lupin taught Harry the lesser-known vulnerabilities of Fenrir Greyback, he would also offer up his own. Did he realize that? And if so, why? How could he trust a student he barely knew with that kind of information? With that in mind, Harry was very aware that it was an opportunity he couldn't refuse. He didn't have any desire to hunt down every werewolf in existence, but neither did he want to become one, and if Lupin could help prevent that, Harry would be an idiot to turn it down. It was better to be safe than sorry, after all. Remember, mate, better catch the snitch. At the very least, you'd better die trying. Not literally though. I think the old battle axe wouldn't be pleased by that. Right, Gred. Absolutely, Forge. Though, Oliver might have a fit if you don't. Catch the snitch, that is. He'll probably die if you did die trying. It's almost romantic. Harry laced up his gloves, eyed Fred and George briefly, and determined, there's something wrong with you both. Why, thank you, Harrykins, Fred said, that has to be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to us. Truly, George contributed. At the same time, Oliver was done with his pacing, and with his obsessive scrutiny of their game plan, and was presently struggling to lace up his gloves. Harry attributed it to the older boy's nerves, because Harry had lost track of the number of times he'd seen Oliver manage the task in the last few years. Merlin, you'd think it was the Quidditch World Cup, Angelina observed. Tell me about it, Alicia agreed. Oi, Kit, go help Wood with his gloves. Katie tied the end of her braid, quickly knotted Oliver's laces, and settled beside Harry on the bench that occupied the center of the Gryffindor locker room. The others huddled around the pair. Oliver clapped his hands together, and then proceeded with the same pregame speech they'd all come to expect from him. He needs some original material, Katie remarked. He needs to calm the hell down. That's what he needs, Harry answered. Apparently there are scouts here. That'll do it, Harry acknowledged, never seen him so nervous. I can't imagine loving Quidditch so much. Harry was inclined to agree, but before he could say as much, they'd reached Madam Hooch and the Slytherins, and custom dictated he stare down his counterpart while the captain squared off. Malfoy, naturally, took advantage of the opportunity to glare at Harry for all he was worth. Again, the depth of loathing was concerning. I want a nice, clean game, Madam Hooch insisted, though the order, was futile. She sent the snitch and bludgers into the air. They each mounted their brooms, and with a blow of her whistle, the quaffle was sent into the air, and the game had begun. In between scans for the snitch, Harry occupied himself with intercepts and feints. Marcus Flint, consequently, was an angry, apoplectic mess, and the Gryffindor team was in the lead, 110 points to 20. Unfortunately, Crabbe and Goyle, despite their brutish appearance, were each a dab hand at beating, and Harry soon found himself having to evade the bludgers they regularly sent his way. Blessedly, Harry caught the snitch before he could get hurt, and the game ended 250-50. Oliver was exultant, and Gryffindor House as a collective entity was triumphant, but before Harry could get drawn into the celebrations, he was surprised by the approach of his godfather. Sirius was in the company of Professor Lupin, dressed finely in expensive robes. According to the awkward, stilted letters they'd exchanged since Yule, he'd spent a great deal of his time recovering from Azkaban, and although Harry was fairly certain that Sirius still had a long way to go, the improvement in his health was obvious. "Hi," Harry greeted, "you look well." "Thanks," Sirius answered, "that was an excellent game. You're quite talented." "Thanks," Harry echoed, cast his gaze around in search of something to talk about, and found nothing. "I didn't know people could come watch the games." "Invite only," Lupin explained. "Professor McGonagall and I thought Sirius would appreciate the opportunity to watch you play." "Right," Harry acknowledged, and queried, "So how are things?" "How's great Aunt Cassiopeia?" "Things are all right, and Cassiopeia's well. We've spent the last couple of months getting my old house up to scratch. I thought about just knocking it down and building it from the bottom up, but Cass wouldn't hear any of that. Said there's too much history in that house. I told her that was the point, but what do you know? The old hag's a persistent nag." Harry chuckled, and Lupin made a quiet retreat. As he did, Sirius swallowed hard, tensed his shoulders, and addressed Harry again. "I wanted to ask you, are you happy living with your relatives? If not, I'm happy to transfer your guardianship over to me." "I didn't want to assume, however." Harry brightened considerably. "You'd do that, of course," Sirius confirmed, and a smile pulled at the corners of his mouth. "Does that mean I should have my lawyer write up that paperwork?" Harry grinned, nodded emphatically, and on impulse, he hugged the man. Sirius returned it with a laugh, brushed his hair out of his eyes, and began a meandering walk towards the castle. Harry fell into step beside him, his broom perched on his shoulder, and together, they chatted idly about inconsequential things until they reached the front doors. "I want you to have this," Sirius said, and offered him a golden medallion. On one face, Harry recognized his family's coat of arms, and on the other, he recognized the House of Blacks. "It's a port key. It won't work on Hogwarts grounds, but if you're off campus, and you feel your well-being is compromised, it will take you to any Black or Potter property you desire. You simply have to say the property name." "What about the Black family wards?" "Already sorted," Sirius assured. "I've not simply been twiddling my thumbs for the last 3 months." "I gathered," Harry acknowledged dryly, slipped the token over his head, and tucked it beneath his Gryffindor jersey. "Thank you. I appreciate it." "No problem. There are a few other things I want to give you. They belong to your dad, mostly, but I actually have to find them first. It might take a while." "You don't have to do that, you know," Harry queried. Sirius waved him off. "It's the least I can do, and moreover, they'd probably come in useful. I mean, James, Remus and I used them to cause mischief, but you seem to attract trouble just by breathing, and they'd be able to help you out in a pinch." "I resent that," Harry grumbled lightly, and Sirius' grin was all teeth. "Do you deny it?" He sighed miserably. "I guess not." They reached Professor McGonagall's office then, and neither made any move to linger over goodbyes. Sirius clapped Harry on the shoulder, promised to see him at the end of term, and retreated into the Flow Network's emerald flames. Harry watched him go, bade his head of house a good afternoon, and returned to Gryffindor Tower. In Gryffindor Tower, the close of Hogwarts, spring term was welcomed with a party. It coincided with Fred and George's 16th birthday, and in typical Fred and George style, they intended to celebrate it with a bang. Thus, prohibited beverages were appropriated, junk food was purchased in bulk, and music was played. Essentially, a good time was had, to be inevitably regretted the next morning. Before then, however, Harry enjoyed the butter beer, the good food, and the good company. "I swear, Gryffindor Tower has more parties than the rest of the houses combined," Faye Dunbar declared, though there was a smile on her face, and Harry didn't think she minded much. "Are you complaining?" Seamus asked, sprawled gracelessly across one of the couches, a giggly lavender tucked into his side. She'd taken the opportunity to give fire whiskey a go, and it seemed to have hit her all at once. "I guess not," Faye conceded, sipped at her butter beer, and scanned the room over her bottle. Slumped into an armchair across from her, Harry watched his fellow third year briefly, followed her gaze, and wondered what she saw. Ron, unsurprisingly, loitered by the food, though he wasn't the only one. Dean and Parvati were there too, all three passionately arguing something if all the arm-flailing and expressive faces were anything to go by. Hermione was tucked into a corner, her head in a book, and Harry frowned to himself. They'd grown distant over the course of the year, and although Harry knew he was largely to blame, he was somewhat disappointed by the fact that Hermione hadn't taken the opportunity to make some new friends. In hindsight, the way the three of them, Ron, Hermione, and himself, had orbited their lives around each other was unhealthy and somewhat pathetic. He and Ron had broken from the pattern though, had made their own friends and developed their own interests beyond nosing into other people's business, but it seemed Hermione hadn't done the same. Not really. You should go talk to her, Faye observed. Harry frowned, and queried, why? Faye shrugged. She's lonely. Most of the time these days, she hides herself away in her books, and when she's not doing that, she's elbows deep in homework, or crying into her pillow. Yeah, Faye agreed, but as I said, you should talk to her. I think she'd appreciate it to know that you haven't forgotten her. I didn't. I know, Faye interjected, I know that. You know that. Most everyone else knows that. But you're the first friend Hermione's ever had, and she doesn't know how to deal with the fact that not all friendships last forever. Harry sighed, but conceded the point with a nod. He finished the last of his butter beer, made a detour to retrieve a couple more for himself and Hermione, and approached the girl where she sat by candlelight. In the orange glow, she looked drawn and weary, and not for the first time, Harry wondered how on earth she was attending all 5 electives. Or 4, now, he supposed. And hadn't that been a surprise? He'd not believed it when he'd first heard, but word that Hermione had stormed out, and dropped out, of divination had been confirmed by Ron, and Harry was inclined to believe the taller boy. He had no reason to lie, anyway, and given that Hermione hadn't denied the stories, the silence was telling. 2 years ago, Hermione Granger had fits at the very thought of losing points, never mind anything else. She'd come a long way since then, but like the rest of them, she had a long way to go. Harry would have never thought she'd drop out of a class, however. He supposed they would all change, eventually. Hi, Hermione, Harry greeted, dropped onto the couch beside her, and offered her a bottle. What are you reading? She glanced up from the textbook, silently accepted the proffered drink, and uncapped it with a spell. He blinked, bemused by the sight, and wondered if he, too, had become so dependent on magic. It's one of the reference texts I used in my ancient runes assignment, she answered. It seemed interesting. He studied the tome, as wide as his palm, and smiled wryly. Just some light reading, then. She shrugged, sipped her beverage, and replied, I guess so. What can I do for you, Harry? Nothing, he answered, I just figured you'd like the company. Do you mind? Hermione shrugged again, cast her gaze over the chaotic common room, and closed the text in her lap. She crossed her arms over her stomach, studied Harry through the corner of her eye, and then proceeded to change the subject. You've got a lot of friends, you know. Harry considered that for a moment, and then shrugged his concession. I guess I do. How do you do it? Harry frowned, mildly puzzled. Do what? Make friends, she answered, and the impatient roll of her eyes wasn't a surprise. He'd lost count of how many times he'd been on the receiving end of the gesture, though it was a lot more intolerable these days. This time, he curbed the reflex to call her out on it. He likely wouldn't in future. Harry shrugged. I don't know. I guess we find common interests. It's not. There isn't a method you can follow, Hermione. Sometimes there are terrifying circumstances, like the troll, you know. Other times, you find common interests, or you have the same goal and it just happens. I can't tell you how I make friends, because I don't know myself. It just happens, I guess. Hermione seemed to slump further into herself, and wiped at eyes that welled with tears. Harry watched, mildly horrified, and tentatively slung an arm over her shoulders. It's okay to make new friends, Hermione, Harry said quietly, People want to be friends with you, you know. You just have to let them. Hermione offered him a feeble smile. I'll try. The following day, the greater majority of first through fourth years headed home for the break, though neither Harry, Theo, Neville, nor Susan were among them. Instead, the four of them were stretched out on the lawns, and begrudgingly occupied with holiday homework. That was, of course, until Theo spoke. It's a full moon tonight. It took a full moment for Harry to register the Slytherin's words, but when he did, he cursed, dropped his quill on the grass, and completely forgot about the potions problems he was supposed to be solving. Beside him, Neville was similarly horrified. Are you joking? Theo's answer was grim. I wish I was. Why does that matter? Susan queried. Harry frowned, shared a glance with Neville and Theo, and with a concise nod, relayed the details of their current plight to their Hufflepuff friend. She listened, wide-eyed, and exhaled shakily when the telling was done. Merlin, there's never a dull moment with you, Harry. I wish there was, Harry answered bleakly, carted a hand through his hair, and compulsively checked for the daggers he never left his dorm without. Theo, no doubt, had silver knives up to his ears, and Harry wouldn't put it past Neville to be carrying a blade or two, as well. It never hurt to be prepared, after all. What are we going to do? Susan queried. If he's here. He's definitely here, Theo interjected. Lupin's been on edge all week. If there isn't another alpha werewolf in his territory, then my eyes aren't brown. Couldn't that just be because of the full moon, though? Not to this extent, Theo refuted. Neville swallowed hard. I don't know about you guys, but I'm kind of concerned that he'll enter the school. The thought hadn't even occurred to Harry, and if Theo's expression was anything to go by, it hadn't occurred to him, either. Susan breathed in and out deeply, firmed her resolve, and determined, then we simply have to give him a reason not to. They actually had a plan. It was reckless, and foolhardy, and probably had more holes in it than Swiss cheese, but it was better than nothing, and desperate times called for desperate measures. It was also something of a last resort. Susan, interestingly, had been ready and rearing to charge in, head first, wands blazing, and Theo was right behind her. It had taken Neville and Harry a solid half-hour to convince them to approach alternative solutions before they did anything drastic. Harry could have choked on the irony. Nevertheless, their first step had been to inform the teachers of their concerns. Lupin was out of the question, simply because he'd be indisposed for the night. Snape, too, wasn't an option. Dumbledore, it turned out, was at a meeting of the International Confederation of Wizards. It left Professors McGonagall, Sprout, and Flitwick available, and opinions were divided. McGonagall had been left in charge of the school during Dumbledore's absence, but Harry couldn't forget the last time he'd gone to her with his concerns. He was more inclined to approach Flitwick, as was Theo, but Neville and Susan were of the opinion Sprout was a better option, if not the deputy headmistress. Why don't we just tell them all? Theo asked gruffly, his hands stained by the grass beneath his palms. The other three looked between themselves uncomfortably, and despite himself, Harry laughed. It hadn't occurred to any of them, and the oversight was ridiculous. Sounds like a plan, Susan acknowledged, a humored grin on her own face, and the two Gryffindors nodded their agreement. I guess Neville and I will tell Professor Sprout. Theo and I will tell Professor Flitwick, then, Harry determined, and at least one of them will tell McGonagall. Hopefully. Once they'd made arrangements to meet up in the library when they'd finished up with Flitwick and Sprout, respectively, the quartet returned to the castle, and proceeded with their search. Professor Flitwick, fortunately, was in his office, and once bade entry, Harry and Theo slowly shuffled inside. Hello, Professor, Harry greeted. Are you busy? I'm never too busy for my students, Flitwick answered cheerfully. Not for the first time, Harry marveled over the fact that this was the same man whom, regularly, kicked Harry's ass 6 ways to Sunday. Take a seat. What can I do for you both? Theo and Harry each settled in 2 of the chairs available, and the head of Ravenclaw offered them both his undivided attention. Harry and Theo looked between themselves, and with a reluctant sigh, Harry took the lead. Professor, tonight's a full moon. We're concerned that Greyback will break into the castle. Neither felt it necessary to add the fact that curfew had been lifted, and inevitably, students would be wandering. The fact was a given, and Professor Flitwick wasn't obtuse. And you believe Fenrir Greyback is already on the grounds? Yes, Professor, Theo answered, I've spent years learning all I could about werewolves. Professor Lupin's been agitated all week. To a certain extent, one could attribute it to the approach of the full moon, but I've studied his behavior since September. He's more tense than usual. That's quite astute of you, Mr. Knott, Professor Flitwick commended, and exhaled wearily. There is very little I can do to ease your concerns. I will, however, bring this matter up with Professor McGonagall, and I will, also, urge my colleagues to be particularly vigilant this evening. Otherwise, every measure available to us has been used to protect Hogwarts from Fenrir Greyback, and there is very little else I can do. Both teams nodded their understanding and left Professor Flitwick to his own devices, and slowly, they trudged their way towards the library. The walk was spent in silence, lost in their respective thoughts, and Harry sighed to himself, not at all comforted by Professor Flitwick's words. Sometimes, everything was simply not enough. Upon sight of Neville and Susan, Harry knew things with Sprout hadn't gone well. Neville wore an uncharacteristic frown on his face, his head bowed in thought, and his arms crossed over his chest. Beside him, Susan appeared lost, as though all of her perceptions of the world had been irrevocably altered, and Harry exhaled through his nose, unsure of what to say. When an authority figure let a person down like that, it was disappointing and disillusioning all at once. Harry had never had much faith in authority figures to begin with, however, and the blow, courtesy of Professor McGonagall, hadn't hit him as hard as it had Ron and Hermione, and as of the last hour, Neville and Susan. How did it go? Neville asked. Harry shrugged. He listened, but he said there wasn't much he could do that's not already been done. More than we can say for Sprout, Neville answered bitterly. He and Theo dropped into seats across from Neville and Susan, and for a few moments, they sat in silence. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given her response from earlier, it was Susan who broke it. We need a plan. That was what had brought him here, seated on the front steps of the castle, the sky stained orange and Susan by his side. Neville and Theo were there too, the latter hovering on his broom, predictably silent, and unable to take his eyes off of the tree line. Neville, in contrast, was slumped against one of the stone pillars that bordered the front doors, a silver knife in hand, and a battered broom by his side. Neville wasn't the strongest flyer, but he was prepared to do his part. He didn't have to, because Greyback probably didn't know him from Adam, but Neville was loyal, and Harry was grateful. He wasn't sure how he'd made such extraordinary friends, Ron and Hermione included, but he wasn't sure he'd ever appreciated them as he should. Now, however, wasn't the time to get sentimental. Thus, he occupied himself with other things on his mind, and he addressed Susan. Why are you so determined to confront Greyback? Susan exhaled heavily, propped her chin in her raised palm, and studied the horizon. Harry wondered if she'd even answer, but she straightened up from her slouch, nodded her head determinedly, and answered, I have a couple of reasons. The first is because he was one of the monsters that killed most of my family, and I promised myself a long time ago that I'd avenge them all. Mostly though, it's because my Aunt Amelia is an Auror, and she always taught me to do the right thing, no matter what it takes. Susan had never appeared more fierce, and Harry was quietly awed. He nodded though, and they said nothing further regarding the matter, and instead sat in a tense, expectant silence. It was broken by Theo. It's almost moonrise, and you should be inside. They started in surprise, and Theo nearly toppled off his broom, but all four settled upon sight of their defense professor. His walk was rather stilted, and he appeared more drawn than Harry could recall seeing, but what was most disconcerting were the golden, lupine eyes that stared at them from their kind teacher's face. Next to him, a massive black canine stood patiently, gaze on Harry, and the teen knew, without prompting, that Padfoot had decided to accompany Moony that night. He's out there, Professor, Susan answered, we can't risk him entering Hogwarts. I'm aware, Lupin replied, and that is admirable. But this is not your fight. It is our responsibility, as your teachers, to guarantee your safety, and we can't do that when you knowingly walk head first into danger. What will you do, Professor? Theo inquired. Harry noted, absently, that he offered no concession to Lupin's words, and he smiled wryly. Slytherins. Lupin's grin was startlingly feral. I have a school to protect, and an old score to settle. He walked ahead then, towards the Forbidden Forest, with Sirius by his side. Harry watched them go, his broom gripped in one hand, one of his daggers in another. The plan had just become a lot more complicated, and the issue a lot more personal. Neville said what was on all of their minds. I did not see that coming. The addition of Lupin and Sirius required a change in their plans, though it was fairly minor. Originally, Neville and Susan would have remained by the doors, on their own brooms, and prepared to fend off Greyback with a small hoard of silver knives and family spells. In the meantime, Harry and Theo had planned to seek Greyback out on their brooms, certain he wouldn't be able to pass up the opportunity their presence presented. Instead, Lupin and Sirius had gone on the offensive, as it were, and although it made things mildly easier with regards to keeping Greyback away from the castle, it also added an element of emotional involvement, too. Harry wanted to go after them, to watch over them and ensure they were okay, though he knew, realistically, that he would only distract them both. Thus, the quartet opted to become the last line of defense, so to speak, and as the last dregs of daylight disappeared beyond the western horizon, Harry mounted his broom, felt for his wand and daggers, and prepared to wait out the night. At the same time, two different howls wrenched the air, succeeded by a deep, resounding silence. I hate waiting, Susan muttered, kicked off into the air, and withdrew her wand to cast a spell over her eyes. Upon sight of their expressions, she flashed them a grin. A night vision spell, Auror level, I learned it over the summer halls. Care to share with the class? Theo joined her in the air, and shortly thereafter, Harry and Neville followed suit. Maybe later, she answered. Before they could protest, however, she proceeded to cast the spell over their own eyes, too. It should last the night, but if it doesn't, let me know. Once he'd thanked her, Harry cast his gaze back to the Forbidden Forest and marveled. It was difficult to believe he could see so well in the dark. The proof was in front of him, however, lit up in shades of green, but clear all the same. No wonder it wasn't common knowledge. If criminals got their hands on it, they'd have a field day. Or night, as it were. Before long, however, the novelty of night vision wore off, and Harry grew restless. Like Susan, he hated waiting, and thus, it only took him about an hour to decide to fly over the trees. Maybe he'd be able to catch sight of the two werewolves. Who knew? Maybe Lupin and Sirius could use his help. He rolled his eyes, and carted a hand through his hair. He wasn't kidding anyone, least of all himself, and Harry just wanted this entire mess to be over. He was tired of worrying, and wondering, and having to constantly look over his shoulder. He wasn't the only one. I'm coming with you, Theo declared. Harry was unsurprised. He was pretty sure Theo wanted Greyback dead, and although Harry couldn't care less which way Greyback left Hogwarts grounds, he also wished Theo would stay by the castle, and thus out of the werewolf's reach. He couldn't protest, however, not when it was as much Theo's fight as it was Lupin's, and definitely not when it wasn't his place to decide what his friends could or couldn't do. That said, he was inwardly skeptical about Theo's ability to kill the werewolf. He had the skills, certainly, and a wizard's wand was a weapon all on its own, but to take a life. It was an entirely different matter. He still had nightmares of the way it felt when Quirrell literally disintegrated beneath his hands, and that had been self-defense, and entirely unintentional besides. To actively seek someone out, and to knowingly, intentionally kill a person. Harry couldn't do that, and he wasn't sure Theo could, either. Thank Merlin, Susan exclaimed, I'm coming too. Harry rolled his eyes, and glanced expectantly at Neville. His friend stared back, defiant. Obviously, he wasn't about to be left behind. Let's go, then. Harry led the way, and his friends followed closely behind. He had no idea where he was going though, beyond the basic understanding that Greyback would remain close to the tree line. Moreover, if a fight was being had, it would be in a clearing to allow for space and range of motion, but that didn't give Harry many answers. Despite his various misadventures within the Forbidden Forest, he wasn't at all familiar with the woods' layout, and thus, he was more or less flying blind. What will we do when we get there? Susan queried. Stay in the canopy, Theo answered, "Observe, and plan accordingly." The silence between them that followed was tense, anticipatory, even, and Harry impatiently drummed his fingers along the handle of his broom. As he did so, his gaze searched the canopy for a break in the trees, and eventually, he found it near the far end of the Hogwarts grounds. There, a pair of wolves were locked in a violent tableau, oblivious to their surroundings, and to the black dog that observed them from the tree line. Neville studied the werewolves below, and dryly asked what Harry wasn't willing to. "Which one's Greyback?" It was difficult to determine colors through the night vision spell, and there wasn't much of a difference between the wolves besides. They were startlingly tall in the shoulders, with short, hug-like snouts and tufted tails. They were vicious though, snarling and growling, and clawing at each other with reckless abandon. All the while, Padfoot watched, tensed, and ready to intervene at a moment's notice. "I've seen pictures of Greyback," Susan muttered, and began a slow descent below the canopy. "If I can just get closer." "Are you mad?" Neville demanded, and intercepted her path. Harry and Theo trailed behind the Hufflepuff, their wary eyes on the bloodied werewolves below. Padfoot had become aware of them, though at first glance, it seemed the werewolves had not. Their fight had raised in intensity, however, and Harry knew better. "Susan, don't be an idiot," Harry reprimanded. Meanwhile, Neville was angry, and the Hufflepuff was preoccupied. Harry's eyes were on his friend, and it was thus that he barely managed to witness what happened next. One of the wolves lunged for Susan. The second missed the intercept by a hair's width. Padfoot, who'd watched Susan's descent, and the wolves as well, lunged, and clashed with the attacking werewolf. At the same time, Susan reeled in response to the offense, lost her grip on her broom, and fell to the ground beneath them. Harry watched her fall, horrified, but he was too far, and the ground too close, to catch her. Susan landed with an ominous crack, and with a cry of pain that was drowned out by the growls and snarls of the two wolves and one dog several feet away. She was all right though, in pain and terrified, but blessedly conscious. He was irked by the complete disregard of her own well-being, but Harry didn't fault her for being afraid. He was scared, too. "Bugger. Watch my back," Theo told Harry and Neville. He lowered himself to the forest floor, stood beside Susan's crumpled form, and spoke with her briefly. While Neville watched over them, Harry dropped to her other side, and took a moment to study the Hufflepuff for injuries. She'd broken her wrist, and the fractured bone had broken skin, but Harry knew no healing spells, and even if he did, there was no time to tend to her injury. Instead, he turned back to the wolves, and watched as Greyback slashed a claw across Sirius' flank. He winced as the dog whined, convulsively gripped his wand, and tried to think of any spell he knew that could help. He couldn't throw knives. Not like Theo could, and to a lesser extent, Neville and Susan, but unfortunately, Werewolfhide was particularly resistant to magic, and Harry wasn't proficient enough with transfiguration to manipulate his surroundings. He was familiar with elemental charms, however, but as a plan began to form in his mind, the situation changed. Behind Theo, Greyback managed to separate himself from Moony and Padfoot's combined attack, and braced himself for another lunge towards the prone students. Harry blanched, and his heart rate, already rapid due to his proximity to Greyback, spiked. He didn't have time to do much of anything defensive, so he did the only thing he could. "Theo." It seemed his warning was unnecessary. Harry had known his friend had plainly extraordinary reflexes, but he'd almost not seen the Slytherin move. Theo whirled, a knife pulled back, and launched it directly through Greyback's eye. The wolf dropped like a stone, the clearing fell silent, and Fenrir Greyback was dead. When Harry woke, it didn't take him long to determine he was in the hospital wing. It seemed he'd fallen asleep while he maintained vigil by Sirius' bedside, but sometime in his sleep, he'd been moved to a bed, his clothes had been changed, his wand and daggers deposited on his bedside table. Professor Lupin was passed out on a bed across from him, and Theo was still under the effects of the dreamless sleep, but several beds down, Susan and Neville were awake, in quiet conversation over their respective breakfast trays. Susan, like Theo, had slept under the effects of a dreamless sleeping draught, but in the light of day, she still seemed weary, and impossibly small. Harry joined his friends, seated criss-cross by Susan's feet, and picked mindlessly at their sliced fruits while they discussed a herbology assignment Harry hadn't even thought about, never mind started. So, Neville trailed off into a vaguely awkward silence, and Susan picked at the bacon she'd not eaten. Some night, her smile was wry. He shrugged. It could have been worse. No one was bitten, Greyback is dead, and everyone will recover. I don't think it could have turned out better, actually. Except, of course, if the defenses had done their bloody job, Neville answered, and the scathing in his tone was startling, albeit justified. Harry shrugged. He'd come to expect the occasional bout of mortal peril at Hogwarts, and although that alone was concerning, he wasn't sure if he had the power to change the status quo. Once again, however, the protections around Hogwarts had failed them, and this time, Harry's life wasn't the only one at stake. It wasn't what I expected, Susan admitted. Were you expecting a grande adventure? Harry's tone was biting, but the irritation left as quick as it had come, and he slumped, tired. Across from him, Susan did, too. I suppose I was, she conceded, and her expression was sad. I'm sorry, Harry. I let you and Theo down. I won't. It won't happen again. Before he could answer, Madame Pomfrey shuffled in with a breakfast tray in hand. She deposited it in his lap, eyed him sternly, and instructed him to eat up. Harry didn't protest, and he instead dug in heartily, famished. She left him to it, and Harry watched as she approached Sirius, wand raised and a diagnostic spell on her tongue. How is he, Madame Pomfrey? It's not the worst injury I've seen from him, Mr. Potter. The slice was rather deep, and I'm sure his side will be rather tender for the days to come, but your godfather will make a full recovery. I can guarantee it. That's good, Harry acknowledged, and the weight on his shoulders eased, and Professor Lupin. With some rest, he will be well. The Medowitch retreated to her office, and Harry focused on his breakfast. As he did, he reflected on the events from the evening prior, and sighed to himself. Although Greyback was dead, the monstrous werewolf was still wreaking havoc on he and Theo's lives. The latter's mostly, since after the shock had worn off, Theo had vomited into the grass, had collapsed by Susan, and had proceeded to babble incoherently, and simultaneously, about how it was finally over, and that he couldn't believe he'd actually killed the monster that had shadowed most of his life. At the same time, Sirius had transformed to his human self, and between a roughshod transfiguration of the corpse into something considerably easier to hide, and the occasional glance at Moony to ensure the wolfsbane potion was still under effect, he took the opportunity to lecture Susan, Harry, Theo and Neville on the topic of recklessness and absolute imbecility, accompanied by a guilt trip of epic proportions. The fact that he was bleeding from a gaping wound in his side kept them from protesting, but Harry was fairly certain he wasn't the only one who'd rankled under the chastisement. With regards to Neville, Susan and Theo, Sirius wasn't their parent or guardian, and neither was he a teacher. In Harry's case, Sirius was a stranger, and legal guardian or not, Harry wasn't particularly fond of authority figures. But then Sirius had staggered from blood loss, and the group, excepting Susan, was suddenly occupied with ensuring he made it to the hospital wing. Moony loped off into the trees with a transfigured bone between his teeth, and meanwhile, the third years had somehow managed to maneuver Sirius onto a broom. Harry, as the strongest flyer, was designated pilot, and before midnight, they'd made it to the hospital wing. Sirius was deposited into Madame Pomfrey's care, and the quartet of Hogwarts students could finally settle down to absorb the events of the hours past. Susan had cried, and Theo had shed a few tears, too. In contrast, Neville was stoic in a way Harry had come to expect from his friend. The other Gryffindor was more comfortable when he had the opportunity to internally sort through his feelings, and Harry couldn't begrudge him that. More recently, Harry was prone to the same routine, and thus, while he'd watched over Sirius, and to a lesser extent, Susan and Theo, he reflected on the actions made and the resulting consequences, meditated over them, and sometime in the dark before dawn, he finally accepted that there was nothing he could change. He pulled himself from his reverie, and studied his Hufflepuff friend. She'd been particularly reckless the night before, but Harry was fairly certain she'd learned from the experience. More to the point, his history guaranteed that he wasn't particularly inclined to give a lecture. Instead, he asked, "How's your arm?" "Good as new," She replied, "It mended overnight. There isn't even a scar." "And how are you?" Susan took a few moments to contemplate her answer. "I feel hollow, I guess. He's dead, and I thought I'd be satisfied with that, but I'm just not." Harry squeezed her blanket-colored feet, and said sagely, "It doesn't bring back your family." Next to him, Neville nodded his agreement. She slumped, wiped at eyes that welled with tears, and replied, "I don't know what I expected. I don't have answers for you, Susan. I'm sorry." She offered him a feeble smile. "It's enough that you understand. You too, Neville, thank you for that." "Any time, Sue," Neville acknowledged, and this time, it was Harry who nodded his agreement. Some time later, they were joined by Theo. The Slytherin was predictably quiet, but there was a shadow in his expression Harry hadn't seen before. It seemed Greyback's death weighed heavy on his mind, and Harry wished he had the right words to say. He didn't. Susan offered him her replenished bowl of fruit. Strawberry. Theo accepted one with a nod of thanks, eyed the game of poker they'd been playing, and queried, "Can I join in?" "Yeah, mate," Neville answered, "I'll deal you in the next round. We're playing for chocolates." They played until mid-morning, at which point Madame Pomfrey sent them on their way. Harry opted to return to his dormitory, and there, he was met by Athena. She was asleep against his pillow, though that was nothing new. She slept a lot these days, and Harry had a feeling she was on her last legs. Despite the short amount of time he'd spent with her, the thought saddened him. He wasn't sure if it was because of Athena herself, or because she was a link to the family he'd not had the opportunity to know. Either way, he was fairly certain he wasn't ready to let her, and what she represented, go. He wasn't certain he ever would be. The 11th of April, it was the first day of classes after the mid-semester break, and Harry was tense. Dumbledore had arrived back from his ICW duties the night before, and Harry had been expecting a summons to the man's office ever since. It seemed meetings with him were par for the course at the end of Harry's annual adventures, and he couldn't fathom why on earth this year's would be any different. At the same time, Harry was ecstatic. That morning, he'd received a letter from Sirius. The man had been successful with regards to his acquisition of Harry's custody, and thus, Harry was now his godfather's ward. Although he'd never intended to, it was a relief to know that, legally, he would never again have to step foot on Privet Drive. Moreover, he now had the opportunity to have a family, and despite the fact it wasn't at all the conventional sort, it was more than Harry had previously. He had no idea what a family would be like, in reality, but Harry was optimistic, and eager to find out. "Did you finish your potions essay?" Ron asked. "I half-arsed it," Harry answered. "Does that count?" It was the only subject that Harry was getting below an E in. He only offered the minimal amount of effort to pass, because Snape wouldn't have appreciated it if Harry intentionally tried, and Harry had given up on trying to please those who didn't give a damn about him. It freed up more time for his other subjects, but as May drew nearer, that didn't say much. "Better than me," Seamus answered, "not even written a paragraph yet." "Good luck with that," Harry answered, and didn't bother to mention that it was due the next morning. Hermione had already mentioned it, frequently, over lunch, and it didn't bear repeating. "I'll bloody need it, won't I?" Seamus offered the rest of them a rueful grin, dropped into the chair at his study desk, and withdrew his potions things with a reluctant sigh. By his own bed, Dean studied his watch. "You've got 16 hours until breakfast tomorrow morning. Have fun, mates." Seamus laughed, and offered Dean the finger. "Bugger off, wanker." Harry followed Dean out of the dormitory, entered the common room, and joined Neville at a seat by one of the tower's windows. He was occupied with a herbology magazine, but as Dean and Harry sat, he put it away, offered them a grin, and asked about Dean's week away. As Dean spoke, Harry was approached by Colin Creevey. The second year was predictably starstruck, and Harry was predictably uncomfortable. Nevertheless, he accepted the missive Colin offered him with a quiet murmur of gratitude, unfurled the scroll, and read it quickly. "Everything all right?" Dean queried. "Yeah," Harry confirmed, and addressed Neville, "We're expected at the headmaster's office after supper." Neville appeared unsurprised. "Do you know if the others are, too?" "I'd assume as much," Harry reasoned. "No use wondering though. We'll see soon enough. What did you do? Dean asked, incredulous. We were only gone a week. It doesn't matter, Harry replied. At least, it's not something worth worrying about. In truth, Harry didn't actually want to say. They'd successfully managed to keep the entire debacle quiet, and he didn't want to deal with the attention it would garner if the student body were to find out. Theo, of course, would bear the brunt of it, but if Harry could avoid any attention, then he would do it without regrets. He wondered if it was selfish of him. Dumbledore's office hadn't changed in 2 months, and Harry hadn't expected it to. Fawkes was stood on his perch, any number of trinkets glimmered in the candlelight, and to his left, the sword of Godric Gryffindor gleamed in its case. It served as an unfortunate reminder of Harry's sojourn into the Chamber of Secrets, and he looked away, mildly discomforted. It wasn't the first time he'd come close to death, but it was the first time he'd ever witnessed an innocent approach that brink, and he never wanted to again. You wanted to see us, Headmaster? Susan queried. They each eyed Dumbledore, expressions expectant. Behind him, their respective heads of house, McGonagall, Sprout, and Snape, stirred from their unmoving scrutiny, and cast their gazes towards the old man, too. Indeed I did, Miss Bones, Dumbledore confirmed. I wish to speak with you all concerning your actions over the semester break. Dumbledore studied them over his half-moon spectacles, and Harry received the discomforting feeling that the aged wizard could see right through them. Unfortunately, Dumbledore was expressionless in turn, and Harry wouldn't have been able to read the man if he'd tried. He didn't. What did you want to say, Professor? Neville asked. He glared at Dumbledore, defiant. As he did, Harry decided that his fellow Gryffindor was the bravest of them all. Because I don't intend to apologize for our actions. Susan, bolstered by Neville's courage, nodded her agreement, and belatedly, Harry and Theo followed suit. I don't regret what we did, Susan opined. We were protecting our classmates because, barring Professor Lupin, no one else bothered to. The resentment in Susan's tone was unmistakable, and it was apparent the Hufflepuff was still stung by Professor Sprout's casual dismissal of her concerns. Behind the headmaster, Professors Sprout and McGonagall looked away in shame. Meanwhile, Dumbledore glanced between Harry and Theo, and queried, "Do either of you have anything to say?" Harry glanced at Theo, who shook his head, "No," and then he addressed Dumbledore, "I think Neville and Susan have said everything that matters." Dumbledore steepled his fingers in front of his face, and spent an impossibly long moment simply scrutinizing them. Then he spoke, and Harry wasn't the only one to tense at his words. "I do not condone your actions on the 2nd of April. Outrage. It burned through him, and indignant, burning fury that coursed through his every pore, caused his magic to thrum beneath his skin, and had his heart pounding violently in his chest. He wasn't the only one, either. Not only did you knowingly endanger yourselves, but you intentionally, needlessly took a man's life." The lecture went on, but Harry tuned it out. He instead occupied himself with trying to calm the hell down, though he wasn't particularly successful. Eventually, blessedly, Dumbledore's lecture wound down, and Harry tuned back in to hear their punishment. "You will each be serving detention until the end of semester. Every night, after supper, with your respective head of house. You are dismissed." They left in silence, and Harry led the way to the classroom he and Theo used to practice with their knives. Then he locked the door, cast a silencing spell at the frame, and glanced at the others. What the bloody hell was that? The unbridled rage was all-consuming. Who the hell does he think he is? If we hadn't intervened, then Dumbledore would be burying his students. Harry paced, his hands tangled in his hair, and certain he'd punch something if he let go. Susan, who was red-faced with her own temper, had unleashed a barrage of bombardment hexes at the disused furniture, mumbling under her breath as she pulverized the aged wood into nothing more than sawdust. "I can't believe he just did that," Neville said. He looked it, too, as though his world had just shifted off its axis. Upon sight of his friend, Harry slowed down, and his temper settled into sizzling embers he could feel beneath his skin. I thought he'd understand. We didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Theo answered bitterly. "It's just that, in this case, the other choice was reprehensible. I don't regret that I killed Greyback. I'm sorry you're in trouble for it, but if it was him, or a student, then I'd do it again in a heartbeat. You and me both, Susan added, and with a stony expression on her face, she determined, you know what? Bugger what he thinks. He's clearly gone senile in his old age. We didn't do anything wrong. The others nodded their agreement, and despite himself, Harry smiled. He, too, couldn't and wouldn't bring himself to regret their choices. They may have taken a life, but if they hadn't, many more would have been hurt, or killed, or turned. As Theo had said, that alternative was reprehensible. He wondered if Dumbledore realized it, though he wasn't about to find out. Dumbledore had just lost any respect Harry had harbored for the man, and Harry was doubtful that he'd ever be able to redeem himself. Where do we go from here? He asked. I don't know about you, but I don't really fancy 2 months of detention. Neither, Neville answered, and I don't know about you lot, but I'm telling my grandmother. She'll pitch a fit that Greyback was able to get on the grounds at all, never mind that only one teacher was willing to do something about it. I'll tell Sirius, Harry contributed. Susan nodded thoughtfully. I'll tell my Aunt Amelia. And I'll tell my grandfather, Theo concluded. In the meantime, will we be going to the detentions? They glanced between themselves, and each shook their heads. The answer was a firm, resounding, no. The 3rd to the 21st of May. As a result of informing their respective guardians of the events surrounding Fenrir Greyback's death, and also informing them of the resulting punishment courtesy of Dumbledore, a formal inquest was opened by the DMLE. Madame Bones, Susan's aunt, couldn't lead the investigation herself due to an unavoidable conflict of interest, but she'd appointed Aurors Owen Savage and Gawain Robards to the task. For Harry and friends, it meant a great deal of time spent in interviews with the 2 decorated officers, a temporary suspension of their punishment, and a great deal of tension between them and their respective heads of house, and between them and Dumbledore as well. Even Harry's lessons with Professor Flitwick had been effected, and Harry still couldn't decide if he was angry at the man or not. On the one hand, his hands were tied, but on the other, what had stopped him from doing what he could, anyway? Rules and regulations hadn't stopped Professor Lupin, after all. That said, all's well that ends well, and did he really have reason to hold a grudge? Greyback was dead, the rest of them were physically unharmed, and the emotional trauma, what was left of it, anyway, would eventually pass. Was he, then, simply being petty? He'd asked Neville in early May, and his friend had sighed wearily, carded a hand through his hair, and answered, I don't know. We shouldn't have had to get involved in the first place. Maybe they need a good kick up the ass to remember that part of their jobs involves keeping us safe. Apart from all of that, much of Harry's time was spent in preparation for the upcoming exams. He and Theo had postponed their training to better focus on their studies, and even Oliver had let up on Quidditch training as most of the team faced the approach of Owl and Newt exams. As he left yet another interview with Savage and Robards, Harry sighed wearily, rubbed at his tired eyes, and approached the library. He'd made plans to meet with Susan before the inquest had called for his attention, and as he dropped into his usual seat with a groan, Susan glanced up at him, a sympathetic smile on her face. Godric, if I'd known if it would take so bloody long, I'd never have bothered with protesting the detentions. It's injustice, Susan reminded him, they can't get away with punishing us for doing their jobs. He grunted, and belatedly took note of the Hufflepuff's bloodshot, red-rimmed eyes, blotchy cheeks and ruddy nose. It seemed she'd been crying, and Harry suddenly had the urge to hurt someone. What's wrong? Do I have to punch someone? Can I fix it? As Susan's eyes welled with tears, Harry panicked. He had no idea what to do with Waterworks, but awkwardly, he lifted himself from his seat, settled down in the one beside his friend, and tentatively draped an arm across her shoulders. Okay, please don't cry. Roughly, Susan wiped at her tears, and explained, Wayne broke up with me. He said he didn't like me hanging out with you and Nev and Theo so much, and I told him I wasn't going to sacrifice my friends to make him happy. So we broke up. What a wanker. She laughed wetly. It's pretty awful, isn't it? I mean, really, who does that? Git. Absolute prat, Harry agreed. He patted her back in an attempt at comfort. I'm sure he'll live to regret that choice, Sue. Too right, she agreed, and seemed to firm her resolve, I don't need him. Of course you don't, Harry agreed. He offered her a tentative smile. You'll be okay. I know. Susan's smile was genuine. Thanks, Harry. He offered her a smile of his own. What are friends for? Harry didn't return to his seat, and instead opted to move his things to his place beside Susan. He opened up his Transfiguration notes, and while their knees and elbows occasionally brushed, the pair focused on their respective work, the silence between them companionable. Harry was tempted to go scare the living daylights out of Wayne Hopkins, as was Theo, but fortunately, Neville had a more level head, and reasoned with them that they couldn't afford to get into more trouble with the senior staff. Thus, they instead contented themselves with the occasional glare at the unfortunate Hufflepuff, and the days drifted by. It was a few days before his first exam when he found Athena, her breaths labored, her eyes closed in sleep. She was on his bed, curled up by his pillow, and Harry knew, without much thought, that Athena was dying. Upset despite himself, he scooped her up in his arms, retreated from the tower, and sought out a secluded place behind Hagrid's hut. He held her in his lap, stroked her fur, and as the sun reached its peak in the sky, Athena took her last breath. Harry buried her beneath the shade of a willow tree, carved her name into the oak, and returned to Gryffindor Tower with his shoulders slumped. He'd not known her long, but he'd gotten attached to the old girl, and it hurt to let her go. He wasn't sure if it was because of Athena herself, or because of what she represented. The fact that he was confused at all, however, made him immeasurably guilty, and as he sat on his bed, he still had no answers. "You all right, mate?" Ron asked, exiting from the bathroom the dorm shared. Harry shrugged. "Athena died. I'm sorry," Ron answered. He offered Harry a sympathetic clap on his shoulder. "You'll be all right." "I can't tell what I'm more upset about," he admitted, and upon Ron's perplexed expression, he briefly explained. "You can be upset about them both," Ron advised. "I know it's not the same, but when we found out about Pettigrew, I was sad. I mean, I was angry, and disgusted, and I felt kind of dirty, but I was sad, too. Because he was my pet. I mean, he obviously wasn't, but I didn't know that. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that you can be upset for more reasons than one, and you can feel more than one thing at once, as well." Harry nodded thoughtfully, thanked Ron for listening, and settled back against his pillows. He thought about Athena, and about her connection to the Potters before him, and swallowed back tears he didn't want to shed. Then he retrieved his family history book, immersed himself in its pages, and for a while, his grief faded. It wouldn't stay that way, he knew, but it was all he needed. The 14th to the 21st of June. When Harry heard that Professor Lupin had resigned, he was unsurprised. The day before, Theo had informed Harry, Susan, and Neville that Professor Snape had let slip that Lupin was a werewolf, and thus, the resignation had been expected. It was no less disappointing, however, because the former Gryffindor was a remarkable teacher, and he would therefore be missed. Despite that, Harry understood. No one ever liked to be where they weren't wanted, and the disgraceful amount of prejudice heaped upon werewolves guaranteed that the howlers, the letters, and the complaints were only a matter of time. "Professor." Lupin glanced up from the tomes he'd been packing, and offered Harry a tired smile. "I thought I'd be seeing you, Harry. I just wanted to check on you," Harry explained. "I'm sorry about Professor Snape. He's a wanker. I'd chastise you for your language. But you're not my teacher anymore, right?" Harry answered, and shrugged. "Can't deny the truth though. He's a git." Lupin's sigh was weary. "Severus Snape and I have never been friends. I can't say I'm surprised by his mistake. In any case, you shouldn't apologize." "I'm sorry you have to go." Then, Harry corrected himself, "You're a good teacher. I enjoyed your class." "I'm glad." And he genuinely looked it, too, with an earnest smile on his face and a lightness in his gaze. "It's been a pleasure to teach you." With his piece said, Harry didn't linger. Lupin seemed eager to leave as quickly and as quietly as possible, and Harry wasn't inclined to make his departure difficult. Instead, he bade the man a good day, insisted he stay in touch, and returned to Gryffindor Tower, and to the friends awaiting him there. "I wonder who the next one will be," Neville mused. He was stretched out across one of the couches in the common room, chin propped on his arms, eyes on the empty fireplace. Lupin's a tough act to follow. I'm not holding my breath, Harry answered, closed his journal, and smiled to himself. At the beginning of the school year, he'd begun a list of spells he intended to learn and memorize, and the evening before, he'd learned the last of them. The feeling of accomplishment was rather satisfying. That way, I won't be disappointed. Whatever, mate, Neville acknowledged. What are you doing these holidays? Harry sighed. Cassiopeia and Sirius had outlined a lesson plan for the summer, and thus, he'd spend most of his holiday absorbed in estate management, legal studies, government, and economics lessons. There would also be etiquette lessons thrown in, courtesy of Cassiopeia, but otherwise, he didn't intend to do much. He probably wouldn't have the time, and although he was somewhat disappointed that he'd not be able to learn swordsmanship from Theo, the actual plans were a step up from his summer holidays previous. I'll be studying, he said. Neville highlighted a planned holiday to Brazil, where he hoped to visit the Amazon rainforest, among other things. Apparently there was a lot of tropical wildlife there that Neville had only ever dreamed of seeing for himself. It was a reward for the improvement in his grades, and Harry wished he could get a reward, too. Then again, he supposed, the lack of privet drive or Dursleys was a reward in and of itself. Should probably stock up on insect repellent, Harry remarked. There's a potion, Neville explained, nasty stuff, but you drink a dose at breakfast, and you're bug-free for the entire day. I think I'd prefer the Muggle version, Harry answered, at least I don't have to taste it. Touché, Neville conceded, sat up with a stretch, and studied his watch. It's almost dinner. What are we waiting for? Harry packed his books away, accompanied his friend to the Great Hall, and settled across from him at the Gryffindor table. Further up, Oliver was in conference with Angelina, Alicia, and Katie, no doubt stressed about the Quidditch final the following day. Harry would freely admit that he was nervous. They were up against Ravenclaw, and although that itself wasn't particularly concerning, Harry had never played the final before, and the prospect was somewhat nauseating. He'd do his part though, would hopefully catch the snitch, but for the moment, he tried not to think about it. As he served himself a helping of steak and potatoes, Dean and Seamus dropped into the seats beside Harry and Neville, arguing about Lupin. He's a werewolf. Seamus seemed to have repeated it a few times. He could have killed us in our sleep. And yet he didn't, Dean reasoned. Mate, Lupin's a nice bloke. You were just saying that he was the best teacher we've had. That was before I knew he turned into a raving monster every month. What about the 30 days out of the month in which he's not a raving monster? Harry interjected. Are you really going to condemn a man because Fenrir Greyback attacked him when he was 6 years old? Dean eyed him, curious. How do you know that? Harry shrugged. He told me. You knew, Seamus exclaimed, and you didn't think to warn us. Warn you about what? That he locks himself up with the Wolfsbane potion every full moon. I might have, but not only was it not my secret to tell, I was afraid people would respond just like you. Unceremoniously, Harry picked up his plate and cutlery, settled himself in a seat beside Lee Jordan, across from Fred and George, and violently cut into his steak. Who pissed in your pumpkin juice, mate? And are we allowed to hex them? Despite himself, Harry smiled. He shook his head though. No, and instead they talked about other things, like the OWL exams, like the end-of-year party planned for the last full day of term, like their respective plans for the summer. Eventually, Harry finished up the rest of his meal and returned to the tower, dropped into a seat near a few of the Gryffindor girls in his year, and withdrew one of his government texts to pass the time. In the morning, Harry was a nervous wreck, and the team wasn't particularly helpful. They seemed more concerned about the possibility that Harry wouldn't make it to the game, and thus, he received the bubble wrap treatment throughout breakfast, and on the way to the Quidditch pitch as well. Cho Chang's your opposition today, Oliver informed Harry. Better not let her distract you, Fred opined. That's what she did with Diggory, George contributed. Stole the snitch from right beneath his nose, Fred took up the thread. Can't really blame the sod. She is a pretty bird, George finished. Not really your type though, right? Alicia appeared distinctly threatening, and George nodded like a bobblehead, pressed a sloppy key to her cheek, and insisted she was the only woman for him. Alicia wasn't impressed. The game prep passed in a blur, and when the game itself began, Harry's nerves settled. Cho Chang, in fact, was a very pretty girl, but forewarned by her tactics, and unimpressed by her tendency to tail him. Besides, Harry managed to catch the snitch without being distracted by the Ravenclaw seeker. When he did, when the Quidditch cup was deposited in Oliver's hands, and red and gold confetti was showered over the team, Oliver cried. The others were buoyant, Harry was too, and his smile was irrepressible. For the moment, inquests, werewolves, studies, none of them mattered. For the moment, the end of term was around the corner, the Quidditch cup had been won, and Harry felt like he'd conquered the world. He never wanted that feeling to fade. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.